Imagine standing in a vast museum filled with thousands of paintings, sculptures, and artifacts from across human history and every corner of the world, and you begin to notice something peculiar about the way we organize and validate knowledge through observation. The paradox of the ravens, first articulated by philosopher Karl Hempel in the 1940s, presents us with a logical puzzle that seems simple on its surface, yet reveals something deeply troubling about how we understand evidence and confirmation. The paradox begins with a straightforward statement: all ravens are black, a claim that seems easily verifiable through observation, for whenever we venture outside and observe a raven soaring through the sky or perched upon a branch, it appears black without exception. However, the logical structure of this statement contains a hidden equivalence that our minds struggle to process intuitively, because the statement "all ravens are black" is logically equivalent to saying that everything that is not black is not a raven, which means that observing a white shoe, a red apple, or a yellow flower technically provides evidence that supports our original claim about ravens. This logical equivalence troubles us because we feel instinctively that seeing a white shoe tells us nothing whatsoever about the color of ravens, yet formal logic insists that it does. The mechanism behind this paradox rests upon the nature of confirmation and how evidence relates to universal statements. For when we make a claim about all members of a category, any observation that is consistent with that claim counts as confirming evidence according to strict logical principles. We have normalized this strange gap between what our intuition tells us and what formal logic demands by simply accepting that logic can diverge from common sense, allowing the paradox to persist as a kind of intellectual puzzle that we acknowledge intellectually yet struggle to truly resolve. Consider the simple organism known as algae, a photosynthetic life form that exists in oceans and freshwater systems across the entire planet. And yet, despite its ubiquity and its fundamental role in producing oxygen and sustaining aquatic ecosystems, we have simultaneously cultivated an almost paradoxical relationship with its existence that reveals something deeply contradictory about how we understand life and necessity. Algae are, by virtually every measurable standard essential to planetary survival, responsible for generating between 50 and 80% of the world's oxygen supply. Yet we reflexively treat algae blooms as disasters, environmental catastrophes worthy of immediate intervention and concern, spending billions of dollars attempting to control, eliminate, or prevent the proliferation of organisms that are quite literally keeping us alive through their biological processes. The paradox deepens when we recognize that algae proliferation is often a symptom of human activity, particularly the introduction of excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus into water systems, meaning that we create the conditions for algae growth through pollution, and then we regard the algae itself as the problem rather than examining our own contribution to the system's imbalance. This psychological mechanism operates because we have learned to associate rapid algae growth with dead zones, with murky water, with the visible signs of ecological disruption. And our minds have become conditioned to see abundance of a microscopic organism as inherently threatening rather than recognizing it as a response to our own environmental pressures. We exist in a state of normalized contradiction where we simultaneously depend upon algae for survival while treating visible manifestations of algae as enemies requiring elimination. And we maintain this cognitive dissonance without significant discomfort, as though the paradox itself has become so deeply embedded. Consider the farmers who spray pesticides across their fields to protect their crops from insects, yet in doing so, they inadvertently poison the very soil that nourishes those same crops, contaminate the groundwater that sustains their communities, and eliminate the beneficial insects that naturally regulate pest populations far more efficiently than any chemical intervention could achieve. The logic seems sound in isolation: remove the pest, save the harvest, ensure survival and profit. Yet this reasoning collapses when we zoom out to see the broader ecosystem at work, because the pesticides that kill harmful insects also kill pollinators, decomposers, and predatory insects that keep pest populations in natural balance. Within a few seasons, pest resistance develops, forcing farmers to use even stronger chemicals in ever-increasing quantities, which only accelerates the degradation of the soil that makes farming possible in the first place. What appears to be a solution to an immediate problem becomes the very mechanism that guarantees future failure. Yet generation after generation of farmers continue this practice because they have no alternative that seems viable within the economic systems that govern their survival. We have normalized a system where the cure is exponentially worse than the disease, where short-term protection requires long-term sacrifice, and where the invisible consequences of our actions feel less real than the visible threat of crop failure staring us in the face during harvest season. The pesticide paradox persists because we have structured our entire agricultural economy around quick fixes rather than systemic balance, because the farmers who profit from selling chemicals have more influence than the voices warning of ecological collapse, and because admitting the truth would require dismantling the very infrastructure upon which millions depend for their livelihoods, making the paradox not merely illogical. Imagine the ocean as a vast and seemingly infinite resource, home to countless microscopic organisms called plankton that form the foundation of nearly all marine food webs on Earth. According to ecological theory, when multiple species compete for the exact same limited resources in the same environment, one species should eventually outcompete all the others and drive them to extinction, a principle known as the competitive exclusion principle. Yet when scientists examine the actual composition of plankton communities in the ocean, they discover something remarkable and deeply puzzling. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of different plankton species coexist peacefully in the same water column, all apparently competing for the same scarce nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and all theoretically unable to do so without one species winning completely. This observation, documented extensively throughout the 20th century and continuing to baffle marine biologists today, became known as the paradox of the plankton, named by ecologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson in his landmark paper that fundamentally challenged our understanding of competitive dynamics in nature. The paradox persists because our mathematical models and laboratory experiments consistently show that such coexistence should be impossible under the rules we thought governed ecological competition. Yet the ocean demonstrates this coexistence daily, suggesting that our fundamental understanding of how species interact and survive remains incomplete or oversimplified. Perhaps the resolution lies in the complexity of real-world conditions that our models fail to capture. The constant churning and mixing of ocean currents that prevent any single species from achieving total dominance, the seasonal fluctuations in nutrient availability that favor different competitors at different times, the presence of predators that selectively remove species before they can monopolize resources, or EVE. Imagine a perfectly balanced ecosystem where a predator and prey species exist in delicate equilibrium, each population naturally regulating the other in a dance that has persisted for thousands of years. Now introduce more food for the prey, more resources, more abundance, and what you might expect to happen is that the entire system flourishes and becomes more stable. Yet something counterintuitive occurs instead. The prey population explodes beyond the predator's ability to control it, which then causes the predator population to skyrocket in response, and suddenly, the system that was stable becomes chaotic and unstable. Both populations begin to oscillate wildly, and the ecosystem that was enriched by additional resources becomes fragile and prone to collapse. This phenomenon, studied extensively by ecologists, is known as the paradox of enrichment, and it reveals something deeply strange about the relationship between resources and stability. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the lag between cause and effect. When resources increase, the prey population responds with a delay, overshooting the carrying capacity of the environment. The predators, responding to this abundance, also overshoot their sustainable population. By the time the predators begin consuming the surplus prey, the prey population has already begun to crash, leading the predators into a feast and famine cycle. The system becomes trapped in oscillations rather than settling at a new equilibrium. It is not scarcity that creates stability, but rather the friction that scarcity introduces into the system, the natural constraints that prevent explosive growth, and the dramatic crashes that follow. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is how it mirrors aspects of human systems that we have never fully reconciled with our understanding of complexity. Consider the moment in history when steam engines became more efficient, when coal consumption per unit of power decreased substantially, and engineers celebrated what seemed like an obvious victory for resource conservation. William Stanley Jevons observed something unexpected in 1865 that would become known as the Jevons paradox, a phenomenon that continues to confound our intuitions about efficiency and sustainability to this day. As machines required less fuel to produce the same amount of work, the total consumption of coal actually increased dramatically rather than decreased, because improved efficiency made coal-powered machinery cheaper to operate, which meant more factories could afford to run more machines for longer hours, and entirely new industries emerged that previously would have been economically unfeasible. This counterintuitive mechanism operates through what economists call the rebound effect, where the money saved through increased efficiency gets redirected into expanded consumption elsewhere in the economy. When your car becomes more fuel efficient, you might drive it more often or travel greater distances because the cost per mile has declined, effectively nullifying part of the environmental benefit that the engineering improvement was supposed to deliver. The same pattern emerges with lighting efficiency, where electric lights were so much cheaper to operate than candles that people dramatically increased their overall lighting consumption rather than simply using the same amount of light at lower cost. This paradox reveals something profound about human behavior and economic systems that we have largely failed to fully integrate into our sustainability strategies despite understanding it for nearly 2 centuries. Consider the peculiar relationship between wealth and happiness that economist Richard Easterlin discovered when he examined data across different nations and time periods. Within a single country at any given moment, wealthier individuals report higher levels of life satisfaction than their less affluent neighbors, a finding that seems straightforward and almost self-evident to most people. Yet when you observe what happens over time within the same nation, as that entire country grows wealthier through economic development and rising incomes, the reported happiness levels of its citizens remain remarkably stagnant, failing to increase in proportion to their newfound material abundance. This creates a profound disconnect between what we expect and what actually occurs. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests fundamentally on the concept of relative deprivation and hedonic adaptation. When you compare yourself to your immediate social circle and neighbors, earning significantly more money does genuinely improve your sense of well-being because you possess more resources than those around you, a status advantage that feels tangible and meaningful. However, when everyone in your society grows wealthier together, your relative position remains unchanged even as your absolute wealth increases substantially. Your neighbor still has a house similar to yours, still drives a car comparable to what you drive, and your children still attend schools alongside theirs. Simultaneously, the human mind possesses an extraordinary capacity to adapt to new circumstances, a process through which luxuries gradually become necessities in the perceived landscape of your life. What once felt like a profound upgrade to your existence becomes merely the baseline expectation within years. Consider the modern supermarket, where a typical store stocks somewhere between 30 and 40,000 different products, each one a solution to some perceived need or desire, and yet the person walking those endless aisles often feels more confused, more anxious, and more uncertain than someone standing before a shelf with 3 choices. And this phenomenon extends far beyond the grocery store into every corner of our contemporary existence, where abundance has become the defining characteristic of developed society. From streaming services offering millions of hours of entertainment that leave us paralyzed by indecision to job markets flooded with opportunities that somehow make career selection feel more impossible than when fewer paths existed, to dating applications presenting countless potential partners that paradoxically make us lonelier than ever before. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through several interconnected psychological pathways. First, the cognitive burden of evaluating options increases exponentially rather than linearly as choices multiply, meaning that moving from 5 choices to 10 choices does not simply double the difficulty, but creates dramatically more mental overhead. Second, the presence of abundant alternatives creates a persistent sense that we might be making the wrong choice, that somewhere among those thousands of products or opportunities exists a marginally better option that we are missing. And this generates a state of perpetual regret or doubt even when we make selections. And third, abundance eliminates the relief that comes from accepting constraint, because when everything is theoretically possible, we internalize the pressure to optimize every decision and select not merely something adequate, but the absolute best available option. Consider the peculiar nature of alcohol as a substance that we have collectively decided to consume despite its fundamentally toxic properties, a behavior that reveals a remarkable paradox at the heart of human culture and psychology. When you drink alcohol, you are essentially introducing a poison into your body, a depressant that impairs your cognitive function, slows your reaction time, and compromises your decision-making abilities. Yet we celebrate this intoxication as pleasure, relaxation, and social bonding. The more alcohol you consume, the more impaired you become, and logically this should correlate with decreasing enjoyment. Yet people often report that increased intoxication brings increased fun and liberation, a sensation that contradicts what is actually happening at the neurological level. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in how alcohol affects the brain's prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for self-awareness, judgment, and inhibition. So as this area becomes depressed and less functional, you paradoxically feel more confident, more social, and more free, not because you actually are those things, but because the very part of your brain that would normally make you aware of your limitations has been chemically silenced. You feel better because you care less, and you feel more capable because you are less aware of your actual incapacity, a cognitive trick that your own neurobiology plays on itself. What makes this particularly fascinating is how normalized and institutionalized this paradox has become across nearly every human culture, where we have built entire social rituals, economic systems, and leisure industries around the consumption of a substance that makes us worse at thinking, worse at coordinating our bodies, and worse at remembering what happened. Yet we continue to frame it as one of life's great pleasures, rather than questioning why we find the sensation of voluntary cognitive impairment so appealing. Consider the curious observation that has puzzled researchers and epidemiologists for decades. Despite having lower average income levels, less access to healthcare, higher rates of poverty, and facing systemic barriers to education and economic opportunity, Hispanic populations in the United States consistently demonstrate health outcomes that rival or even exceed those of wealthier, more educated populations. This phenomenon extends across numerous measurable health indicators, from life expectancy and infant mortality rates to cardiovascular disease incidence and overall mortality from most major causes. The paradox deepens when you examine the apparent logical chain that should connect socioeconomic disadvantage directly to poor health outcomes. Yet somehow this connection appears to be broken or significantly weakened within this particular demographic group. The mechanism behind this puzzling reality seems to involve a constellation of protective factors that operate almost independently of traditional wealth and access metrics. Strong family structures and multi-generational living arrangements create built-in support systems that buffer individuals from the isolation and stress that typically accompanies poverty in other communities. Cultural dietary patterns that emphasize fresh produce and traditional foods, maintained despite economic constraints, provide nutritional advantages that might otherwise be lost at lower income levels. Social cohesion and community engagement create psychological resilience that somehow translates into measurable physiological benefits, as though the human body responds differently to adversity when surrounded by collective strength. What makes this paradox particularly mind-bending is how it persists in the face of every logical reason it should not exist, suggesting that our models of health determinism are incomplete, that the unmeasurable dimensions of human experience hold power we scarcely understand. Picture a nation of people who consume significantly higher quantities of saturated fats, butter, cheese, and rich foods than their American counterparts, yet somehow maintain lower rates of cardiovascular disease and obesity, living longer and seemingly healthier lives despite what our modern nutritional science tells us should be happening to their arteries and their waistlines. This is the French paradox, a genuine epidemiological mystery that has puzzled cardiologists, nutritionists, and public health officials for decades, because according to every conventional understanding of diet and disease, the French should be suffering far worse health outcomes than they actually do. The mechanism that creates this paradox likely involves multiple interlocking factors that work together in ways our reductionist approach to nutrition has failed to adequately measure or understand. The French tend to eat smaller portion sizes. They consume meals slowly over extended periods. They drink wine regularly with food rather than between meals. They walk more in their daily lives. They maintain lower stress levels about eating itself, and they have stronger social connections and community bonds that correlate with overall health in ways that have nothing to do with macronutrient ratios or caloric content. Yet despite having access to this knowledge, despite understanding that factors like lifestyle, pace, social connection, and overall stress management matter tremendously, modern Western culture continues to obsess over individual dietary components in isolation. counting calories and demonizing fats while largely ignoring the broader context in which food is consumed. The paradox persists precisely because we have normalized a fundamentally fragmented way of thinking about health that separates food from culture, nutrition from psychology, and individual dietary choices from the entire ecosystem of living in which those choices occur. So we remain genuinely. Consider the strange phenomenon known as the obesity paradox, wherein individuals classified as obese according to standard medical measurements paradoxically demonstrate better survival rates following certain serious health events than their normal weight counterparts. A discovery that seems to contradict everything we understand about weight and health outcomes. When patients suffer heart attacks, strokes, or develop heart failure, medical data consistently shows that those carrying excess body weight often live longer and experience better recovery outcomes than lean individuals facing identical conditions, creating a baffling contradiction in medical literature that researchers have struggled to explain for decades. The mechanism behind this counterintuitive reality operates through several overlapping factors that create a peculiar protective effect, beginning with the notion that obese patients who survive to the point of suffering these major cardiac events are paradoxically a healthier subset of the obese population, having already survived the selection process that eliminates the most vulnerable. Additionally, excess adipose tissue functions as an energy reserve during the acute stress of recovery, providing metabolic resources that lean individuals simply do not possess, allowing the body to endure the intensive healing process without catastrophic depletion of essential nutrients and reserves. The phenomenon also reveals that physicians tend to treat obese patients more aggressively during acute events, prescribing stronger medications and more intensive interventions precisely because they perceive greater risk, thereby inadvertently providing superior care that improves outcomes. Yet this paradox persists in medical consciousness despite its obvious logical explanation, because our cultural and scientific narrative about obesity remains so deeply embedded that we struggle to accept that excess weight could provide any protective. Consider the strange statistical phenomenon known as the low birth weight paradox, a medical mystery that has puzzled epidemiologists and researchers for decades, challenging our fundamental understanding of how risk factors should work in predictive models. In traditional medical logic, we would expect that smoking during pregnancy causes harm across the board, increasing both the risk of low birth weight infants and increasing the mortality rate among those low birth weight babies. Yet when researchers examine the data with careful statistical analysis, they discover something counterintuitive and deeply unsettling. Among low birth weight infants, those born to mothers who smoked during pregnancy actually have slightly better survival rates than those born to non-smoking mothers, even though maternal smoking is undeniably harmful and increases the likelihood of low birth weight in the first place. This creates a logical knot that seems to defy explanation, where a known harmful behavior appears protective when you zoom in on a specific subset of the population. The mechanism behind this paradox emerges when you understand that selection bias is doing the work invisibly in the background, operating like a hidden hand shuffling the data in ways our intuition never anticipated. Smoking causes low birth weight babies, but it also causes the most severely compromised and non-viable pregnancies to end in miscarriage or stillbirth before birth weight can even be measured, effectively removing the most fragile cases from the dataset entirely. This means that among surviving low birth weight infants born to smoking mothers, you have selected for the relatively healthier babies who managed to survive despite the smoking exposure, while low birth weight babies born to non-smokers include the full spectrum of vulnerability, including those with severe genetic or developmental problems. The Groucho Marx paradox emerges from a famous quip attributed to the comedian, who once said that he would never want to join any club that would have him as a member, a statement that captures something deeply unsettling about human desire and self-worth. Imagine a person who desperately wants to belong to an exclusive social group, spending months or years cultivating the right appearance, connections, and credentials to gain entry, only to find that the moment they are accepted, they immediately lose interest in the organization itself. The paradox suggests that our desire for something is often inversely proportional to our ability to actually obtain it, creating a self-defeating cycle where achievement destroys motivation. When we finally gain access to what we thought we wanted, The very fact that we were able to achieve it makes us question whether it was ever truly worth having in the first place, because if we could join it, then perhaps the standards were not as rigorous as we believed them to be. This psychological mechanism operates on the principle that we unconsciously assign greater value to things that seem unattainable or difficult to acquire, and simultaneously devalue things that come too easily or accept us too readily. We interpret acceptance as evidence of mediocrity, reasoning that a truly prestigious institution would be more selective and discriminating in its choices. The paradox persists in modern life across dating, career advancement, and social hierarchies, where people find themselves dissatisfied immediately upon achieving their goals, constantly chasing the next exclusive opportunity rather than finding contentment in their accomplishments, trapped in an endless cycle of desire for what remains just beyond reach. Consider the simple mathematical truth that all positive integers can be paired with their perfect squares, creating a one-to-one correspondence between these two sets. Yet intuitively it seems there must be fewer perfect squares than there are regular integers, since every perfect square is a positive integer, but not every positive integer is a perfect square. Galileo himself identified this troubling observation in the 17th century, recognizing that the set of all perfect squares, such as 1, 4, 9, 16, and 25, appears to be a proper subset contained within the larger set of all positive integers. And yet, through mathematical pairing, we can demonstrate that these two infinite sets possess exactly the same cardinality or size. This paradox emerges from our intuitive understanding of comparison, an understanding that works perfectly well when we count finite collections, but breaks down catastrophically when we attempt to apply those same principles to infinite quantities. The mechanism underlying this paradox involves the fundamental difference between how infinity actually behaves mathematically and how our brains have evolved to conceptualize size and quantity. Our intuitions about sets developed through millions of years of evolution dealing with finite herds, finite resources, and finite spatial arrangements, creating a deeply ingrained sense that removing elements from a collection always makes it smaller. When we encounter the concept of infinity, however, we continue applying these finite world rules to infinite world mathematics, leading us to expect that a proper subset must be smaller than its containing set. What makes Galileo's paradox so persistently disorienting is that our intuitive understanding refuses to accept the mathematical reality even after we have seen the proof demonstrated clearly before us, because no amount of logical explanation can fully override the powerful evolutionary instinct that. Imagine a geometric shape so peculiar that it challenges the very foundations of how we understand volume and surface area, a three-dimensional object created by rotating a specific mathematical curve around an axis, producing a form that resembles a horn or trumpet extending infinitely into space. This is Gabriel's horn, named after the archangel Gabriel, who is said to blow a horn to announce the day of judgment, a fitting mythological reference for something so paradoxically infinite yet finite in nature. The mathematical construction begins with a hyperbola, a curve that approaches but never touches certain lines, and when this curve is rotated around one of its asymptotes, it generates a shape with astonishing properties that seem to defy intuition. The paradox emerges from a remarkable discovery that mathematicians made when they began calculating the properties of this horn. While the surface area extends to infinity, the volume contained within remains finite and bounded, a contradiction that appears to violate our basic understanding of how objects work in three-dimensional space. If you were to fill this horn with paint, you would need only a finite amount, yet if you attempted to paint its outer surface, you would require an infinite quantity of paint, a situation that seems logically impossible according to everyday experience. The mechanism driving this paradox lies in the nature of infinity itself and how different mathematical properties scale at different rates as dimensions extend outward, creating a situation where convergence and divergence operate simultaneously on different measurements of the same object. What makes this paradox particularly mind-bending is that it reveals the inadequacy of our intuitive spatial reasoning when dealing with infinity, forcing us to confront the fact that the rules governing our familiar three-dimensional world break down when extended into mathematical abstractions. Consider the rational voter engaged in the democratic process, standing in a polling booth with the power to shape the future through a single vote, yet simultaneously recognizing that their individual ballot will almost certainly make no measurable difference whatsoever in the final outcome, particularly in large-scale elections where millions of other citizens cast their votes alongside them. This is the essential paradox identified by political economist Anthony Downs, who observed that the probability of any single vote determining an election's result is mathematically vanishingly small, often calculated at odds so remote that they border on the impossible, yet despite this logical understanding, citizens continue to vote in substantial numbers across democratic nations. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals itself through the intersection of rational choice theory and human psychology, where Downs argued that if voting were purely a rational calculation of personal benefit weighed against personal cost, the expected utility of voting should be negative for most citizens, since the probability of casting the deciding vote multiplied by the value of a preferred outcome still yields an infinitesimally small number when compared against the time, effort, and inconvenience required to vote. And yet millions persist in this ostensibly irrational behavior, suggesting that voters either consciously or unconsciously apply different psychological frameworks to the voting decision than strict rational utility maximization would predict. The paradox persists because humans derive meaning and value from participation itself, rather than merely from calculating instrumental outcomes, because they perceive voting as a civic duty that transcends mathematical expectation, and because the psychological satisfaction derived from exercising democratic agency appears to constitute a hidden variable in the equation that traditional rational choice theory fa. Imagine a group of 3 people trying to decide what to do on a Friday night. They can either go to a movie, grab dinner, or stay home and watch television. The first person prefers the movie to dinner and dinner to staying home. The second person prefers dinner to staying home and staying home to the movie. The third person prefers staying home to the movie and the movie to dinner. Now, if you ask the group to vote on what they prefer between the movie and dinner, the majority chooses the movie. If you ask them to vote between dinner and staying home, the majority chooses dinner. And if you ask them to vote between staying home and the movie, the majority chooses staying home. This means that the group has collectively expressed a preference for the movie over dinner, dinner over staying home, and staying home over the movie, creating a circular preference that violates the basic principle of transitivity, which states that if you prefer A to B and B to C, you must prefer A to C. This is the Condorcet paradox, named after the 18th century mathematician and philosopher Marie-Jeanne Antoine Nicolas de Caratat, Marquis de Condorcet, who first identified this peculiar phenomenon in voting systems. The paradox reveals that individual preferences, when perfectly rational and consistent within themselves, can combine through democratic voting to produce collective preferences that are fundamentally irrational and internally contradictory. What makes this paradox so unsettling is that it demonstrates how a group of rational actors following perfectly reasonable voting procedures can arrive at a conclusion that no single individual in the group would actually endorse if presented with it directly. The mechanism at work here involves the structure of preferences and how they interact when aggregated through majority rule. Imagine you are part of a group tasked with making a collective decision about something that matters to everyone involved, whether it is choosing a new policy, selecting a leader, or determining how to allocate shared resources. And you believe that if you simply aggregate the individual preferences of all members through some fair voting system, you will naturally arrive at a conclusion that represents the group's true will. Yet this intuition collapses under scrutiny when you encounter Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem, which demonstrates mathematically that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a small set of seemingly reasonable and non-negotiable fairness criteria. Arrow proposed that any legitimate democratic process should respect certain principles. It should allow for any possible ordering of preferences among voters. It should not be dictatorial where one person's preference always wins regardless of others. And if everyone prefers option A to option B, then the collective decision should also prefer it to B. Yet when you actually attempt to construct a voting method that honors all these requirements at once, you discover that it becomes mathematically impossible, which means that every voting system ever devised, from simple majority rule to complex weighted preference systems, must inevitably violate at least one of these principles. The mechanism behind this paradox operates on the level of logical consistency itself, where the constraints you are imposing are so fundamental that they create an inescapable contradiction at the mathematical core of preference aggregation. Similar to how you cannot construct a map that simultaneously preserves all geometric properties of a sphere when flattening it into two dimensions. Consider the rational calculus of voting in a modern democratic election where millions of people cast their ballots across an entire nation or region, where your single vote among millions has virtually zero statistical probability of determining the outcome of any election. The voting paradox emerges from this mathematical reality. If we accept that rational actors make decisions based on expected utility, then the expected benefit of voting should equal the probability that your vote will be decisive multiplied by the value of the outcome you prefer. And since the probability of being decisive approaches zero in large elections, the rational choice would be not to vote at all. Yet billions of people continue to vote regularly despite understanding, at least intuitively, that their individual vote almost certainly will not change the result. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves what researchers call expressive voting or symbolic voting, where people vote not because they genuinely believe their vote will alter the electoral outcome, but because voting serves other functions entirely, such as expressing their values, affirming their identity as a citizen, maintaining self-image as a responsible participant in democracy, or engaging in what amounts to a collective ritual that feels meaningful regardless of its mathematical insignificance. We have constructed an entire social and political infrastructure around the assumption that individual voting behavior matters tremendously. We celebrate voting as a fundamental right and duty. We shame non-voters, and we embed deep cultural narratives about the power of the individual ballot. Yet we simultaneously know with absolute certainty that in any large-scale election, the vast majority of votes are cast with no reasonable expectation of influencing the result. Imagine a person who dedicates their entire existence to the pursuit of pleasure, arranging every moment, every decision, and every resource around the singular goal of maximizing their own happiness and enjoyment. Yet despite this relentless focus on pleasure-seeking, they find themselves feeling increasingly empty, dissatisfied, and paradoxically less happy than someone who pursues pleasure only as a secondary benefit of living a meaningful life. This is the paradox of hedonism, and it operates on a principle so counterintuitive that it challenges our most basic assumptions about what it means to want something. The mechanism at work here involves the curious way that happiness functions when pursued directly rather than achieved as a byproduct. When we fixate entirely on pleasure and happiness as our primary objective, we create a kind of psychological distance between ourselves and the satisfaction we seek, much like trying to fall asleep by desperately willing yourself to sleep, which only produces the opposite effect. The mind requires what might be called a peripheral vision approach to genuine satisfaction, where happiness arrives most abundantly when we are focused on other pursuits, relationships, creative endeavors, or meaningful contributions to the world around us. A person chasing pleasure moment to moment, switching from one sensation to another in search of the next hit of dopamine, becomes trapped in an exhausting cycle where each pleasure diminishes in intensity, leading to the constant need for escalation and novelty, while simultaneously losing the capacity to derive deep satisfaction from simple experiences. This paradox persists in our modern culture with remarkable tenacity despite being logically understood by most people, perhaps because the immediate gratification offered by pleasure-seeking still feels more tangible and achievable than the uncertain rewards of delayed gratification or purpose-driven making. Consider the moment when you attempt to deeply analyze something you once understood intuitively, whether it is a skill you have practiced for years, a relationship you have maintained, or an emotion you have felt countless times before. And in the very act of breaking it down into constituent parts, examining each element with conscious attention, the thing itself seems to dissolve or become fundamentally altered by your scrutiny. A musician who has played a piece flawlessly for decades suddenly becomes uncertain about finger placement once they begin analyzing their technique in slow motion. A person in love finds that constantly questioning whether they truly love their partner, examining the relationship from every logical angle, somehow undermines the spontaneous certainty they felt before the analysis began. The paradox is that analysis, which should theoretically increase understanding and mastery, instead creates confusion and disruption through the very mechanism of investigation itself. This occurs because many complex human experiences exist in a state that requires a particular kind of cognitive distance to function properly, and the moment you close that distance by bringing analytical scrutiny too near, you alter the very phenomenon you are attempting to understand. The act of observation changes the observed, not in a quantum mechanical sense of particles responding to measurement, but in a deeply practical one where consciousness directed inward disrupts the fluid, pre-reflective operation of skills and emotions that depend on a kind of automaticity to work correctly. We normalize this paradox by developing strategies around it, telling ourselves to stop overthinking, to trust our instincts, to simply allow certain things to be without interrogation. Consider the peculiar situation where a person finds themselves trapped in a conversation with someone they actively dislike, yet they continue the interaction with what appears to be genuine interest and engagement, nodding along, asking follow-up questions, and even laughing at jokes they do not find amusing. This is Allen's paradox, named after the observation that we often invest significant emotional and social energy in relationships or interactions that bring us no real satisfaction, simply because we have already invested time in them previously. The mechanism operates through what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy, combined with social obligation scripts that run so deeply in our consciousness that we often do not notice them executing. When we have spent months or years with a person, we create an internal narrative that suggests we ought to continue the relationship out of loyalty or habit, even when every present moment indication suggests we would be happier without their presence. Our brains treat past investment as a reason to continue present investment, even though logically, the past cannot change the future value of a situation. We sit through dinners with people who drain us, we maintain friendships that feel obligatory rather than joyful, and we stay in social circles that no longer align with who we have become, all because we have already put in the time. The paradox deepens when we recognize that this behavior persists even among those who pride themselves on rationality and self-awareness. We have normalized the idea that abandoning someone we once valued is somehow a betrayal, even when staying with them becomes an equally significant form of self-betrayal. The pull of consistency keeps us anchored to decisions made by earlier versions of ourselves who possessed different information and different needs. Imagine you are tasked with measuring the coastline of Britain, a seemingly straightforward geographical question with a definite answer waiting to be discovered. You begin with a ruler and a map, tracing the visible outline of the coast, and you arrive at a measurement of perhaps 8,000 kilometers. But then you decide to be more precise, using a smaller ruler to measure around the bays and peninsulas that your first ruler was too large to follow into their detailed contours, and suddenly your measurement grows to nearly 12,000 kilometers. You continue this process, using progressively smaller and smaller measuring instruments, examining the rocks and stones, the crevices and tide pools, each level of magnification revealing new jagged edges that your previous measurement had glossed over, and the coastline continues to grow longer and longer with no apparent end to this expansion. This is the coastline measurement paradox, a phenomenon first formally described by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot in 1975, which reveals that the length of a coastline is not a fixed property waiting to be discovered, but rather depends entirely upon the scale at which you choose to measure it. The paradox reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of physical reality itself, suggesting that properties we assume to be intrinsic and measurable are actually contingent upon our method of observation. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the fractal nature of coastlines, where each smaller section contains the same statistical properties as the whole, creating an infinite regress of detail that becomes visible only as you zoom closer and closer into increasingly minute measurements. We have normalized this paradox so completely in modern geography and cartography that we simply choose a standard measurement scale and declare that to be the official coastline length, pretending that our choice of instrument. Consider a society built entirely upon the principle of tolerance, a civilization that has committed itself to accepting all viewpoints, all beliefs, and all expressions of human thought without restriction or judgment. Yet as this society extends its tolerance further and further into the depths of human ideology, it encounters an unexpected contradiction that seems to undermine the very foundation upon which it was constructed. The paradox emerges when we ask a deceptively simple question: should a tolerant society tolerate the intolerant? If we allow those who seek to destroy tolerance itself to operate freely within our borders, to spread their ideologies without constraint, and to organize their followers without impediment, do we not risk creating the conditions for our own undoing? This tension reveals itself in countless real-world scenarios where democratic nations struggle with how to handle extremist movements, hate speech, and authoritarian ideologies that explicitly reject democratic values. A society that permits Nazi parties to organize, that allows genocidal rhetoric to flourish in the marketplace of ideas, that grants platform and protection to those who would eliminate platform and protection for others, seems to be actively facilitating its own destruction through the very mechanism of tolerance that defines it. The logical mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a kind of recursive loop where unlimited tolerance becomes self-defeating because it creates the conditions necessary for intolerance to gain power. Yet simultaneously, the moment a society decides to limit tolerance by restricting intolerant voices, it has technically violated its own founding principle and become something other than purely tolerant. We find ourselves trapped in a genuinely paradoxical situation where both paths seem to lead toward contradiction. Complete tolerance leads to the extinction of tolerance itself, while enforcing tolerank. Consider the peculiar reality that water, essential for human survival and available in abundance across most of the planet, costs almost nothing, while diamonds, beautiful but entirely inessential to our existence, command prices that can bankrupt entire families or fund institutions. This is the paradox of value, and it has confounded economists and philosophers for centuries, revealing something deeply strange about how we assign worth to the things around us. Adam Smith first observed this puzzle when he noticed that the things most necessary for life are often the cheapest, while luxuries and rarities command extraordinary sums, and he recognized that the value we perceive bears almost no relationship to the utility or necessity of the object itself. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a principle called marginal utility, which suggests that the value of something is determined not by its total importance to humanity, but rather by how much we value one additional unit of it, given that we already have plenty. Water is so abundant that an additional liter brings almost no satisfaction to someone who already has enough to drink, while a single diamond represents something rare and unique that few can possess, and therefore the desire for it remains sharp and unfulfilled. Our brains also attach value through scarcity signals and social signaling, where possessing something rare becomes a marker of status and wealth, making diamonds psychologically valuable in ways that water can never be, regardless of water's objective importance to our survival. We have normalized this paradox so completely that it no longer strikes us as strange, and we construct elaborate systems of luxury markets and premium pricing around exactly this principle, treating it not as a logical puzzle, but as simply how the world works, even though it fundamentally contradicts the notion that value should track necessity or importance. Imagine a nation where the majority of citizens decide, almost simultaneously, to reduce their spending and increase their savings in an effort to build personal security and financial stability. On the surface, this seems like a perfectly rational decision, a collective embracing of prudence and responsibility that should strengthen the economy as a whole. Yet what unfolds is a counterintuitive economic phenomenon. As individuals save more and spend less, the total demand for goods and services in the economy shrinks, causing businesses to reduce production, lay off workers, and cut investments. These unemployed workers and struggling businesses then spend even less, further reducing demand in what becomes a vicious cycle. The very behavior that should create prosperity, individual thrift and restraint, paradoxically generates widespread economic contraction, recession, and hardship for everyone, including the very people who are trying to secure their futures through saving. What appears virtuous at the individual level becomes destructive at the collective level, a mathematical inevitability that confounds our intuitions about how economies function. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the fundamental interconnectedness of modern economic systems, where one person's spending is another person's income, and income is the foundation upon which consumption, employment, and investment all depend. When millions of households simultaneously withdraw demand from the system, they inadvertently sabotage the economic engine that generates the income they depend upon, creating a situation where saving money individually makes sense, while saving money collectively becomes economically catastrophic. We have normalized this paradox by accepting it as simply how economies work, acknowledging it in economics textbooks and policy discussions, yet continuing to encourage individual savings and frugality as moral virtues without adequately addressing the. Imagine a protein molecule, one of the most fundamental building blocks of life, attempting to fold itself into its proper three-dimensional shape. The protein chain contains hundreds or thousands of amino acids, each one capable of rotating and bonding in multiple configurations, and each decision point creates exponentially more possible arrangements than the last. If the protein were to randomly sample every conceivable configuration it could adopt, exploring them one by one at the rate of 1 trillion possibilities per second, it would take longer than the age of the universe itself to find the correct folded state, yet somehow proteins manage to fold themselves correctly in milliseconds to seconds. This is Levinthal's paradox, named after the scientist Cyrus Levinthal, who first articulated this seemingly impossible problem in 1968. The paradox reveals a fundamental mismatch between what mathematics suggests should be possible and what we observe happening in nature every single moment inside every living cell on Earth. The mechanism behind this paradox centers on the fact that protein folding is not actually a random search through all possibilities, but rather a guided journey shaped by chemical forces, thermodynamic principles, and constraints that dramatically reduce the search space. Amino acids have preferences for certain neighbors based on electrical charges, hydrophobic interactions, and hydrogen bonding patterns, which means the folding process follows energetically favorable pathways rather than exploring blindly through an impossible combinatorial landscape. Yet despite our understanding of these underlying mechanisms, there remains something deeply puzzling about how nature solves this optimization problem so efficiently, as if proteins possess an inherent knowledge of their destination before they arrive there, and we continue to study protein folding with intense focus because the paradox reminds us that our. Consider the fascinating and somewhat bewildering observation that genome size, the total amount of DNA contained within an organism's cells, bears virtually no relationship whatsoever to the complexity of that organism or its position on the evolutionary ladder of sophistication. A single-celled amoeba called Polychaos dubium contains approximately 100 times more DNA than a human being does, yet we possess vastly more intricate neural networks, behavioral repertoires, and cognitive abilities than this microscopic creature could ever achieve. Similarly, the lungfish carries a genome roughly 40% larger than our own, despite having a brain and behavioral complexity that pales in comparison to human achievement. This observation, first formally recognized by scientists in the 1960s, became known as the C-value paradox, named after the constant value representing the total amount of DNA in a haploid nucleus. The mechanism behind this paradoxical situation stems from the fact that much of an organism's genome consists of repetitive sequences, transposable elements, and what was long dismissed as junk DNA that serves no obvious coding function for protein production. The amount of DNA does not translate directly into biological complexity because complexity arises not merely from the quantity of genetic material, but from how that material is regulated, expressed, and organized into functional networks. We have normalized this paradox by gradually accepting that bigger is not necessarily better in biological systems, and that evolution does not favor genome expansion as a marker of progress or sophistication. Yet we still occasionally catch ourselves assuming that more of something must somehow be superior, revealing how deeply intuitive assumptions about scale and complexity are embedded in human cognition. Imagine you are sitting at a breakfast table, and someone places before you a carton of eggs that you purchased just this morning from your local grocery store, eggs that have been refrigerated continuously since their purchase, eggs that appear entirely ordinary in every conceivable way. You crack one open and find, to your complete shock and bewilderment, that it contains 2 yolks instead of the single yolk you have encountered in virtually every other egg you have consumed throughout your entire life. Your immediate reaction is one of surprise, of genuine astonishment, as though you have witnessed something genuinely remarkable and unusual. Yet when you pause to consider this reaction logically, you realize that there is absolutely nothing inherently surprising about this occurrence whatsoever. Double yolk eggs exist naturally in chicken populations at a measurable and consistent rate, occurring in perhaps 1 out of every 500 or 1,000 eggs, depending on the breed and age of the hen. They are not rare mutations or defects, but rather normal biological variations that have existed since humans first began consuming eggs. The surprise you feel emerges not from the egg itself being unusual in any objective sense, but rather from the violation of your expectations based on limited personal experience. Your mind has constructed a statistical model of egg reality based on the eggs you have personally encountered, a sample size so minuscule as to be essentially meaningless when compared to the true distribution of egg characteristics in the world. The paradox resides in the fact that your astonishment is entirely subjective and based on ignorance rather than on any genuine rarity or abnormality. We continue to be surprised by the expected because our individual experience creates the illusion of knowledge about patterns that operate far beyond our capacity to directly observe. Consider the novel The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, written by Lawrence Sterne in the 18th century, which presents a peculiar temporal problem that has fascinated philosophers and mathematicians for centuries. The narrator, Tristram Shandy, attempts to write his autobiography with meticulous detail, describing every moment of his life with complete accuracy and precision, yet he finds himself perpetually unable to catch up with the present moment, for the very act of writing about what has already occurred requires time, and during that time, new moments accumulate that also demand description. This creates an impossible situation where Tristram discovers that he can never complete his autobiography because he is always falling further behind, as each day he lives generates more material than he can possibly document in the same day, meaning that the gap between the present moment and what he has written about only widens with each passing hour. The paradox emerges from the tension between the finite rate at which events occur in life and the slower rate at which those events can be narrated, transcribed, and reflected upon with adequate detail. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something profound about human perception and documentation. We intuitively understand that comprehensive recording of experience is theoretically impossible, yet we persist in attempting to capture our lives through journals, photographs, videos, and social media posts, despite knowing intellectually that no documentation could ever be complete or truly representative of lived experience. We have normalized this fundamental inadequacy by accepting that partial records, selective memories, and curated narratives are sufficient approximations of reality, even though we remain aware that something essential always escapes our attempts to pin down and preserve what we have lived through, leaving us eternally chassis. Imagine a lamp that has been switched on and off infinitely many times, with each switch taking progressively less time than the last, and imagine that all of these infinite operations complete in just 2 minutes, with the switching happening faster and faster as we approach that 2-minute mark, creating a paradox so disorienting that it forces us to confront the very nature of infinity itself and what it means for something to actually be complete. This is Thomson's lamp, a thought experiment conceived by philosopher James F. Thomson in 1954, and it reveals a profound problem with how we think about infinite processes and their ultimate outcomes. The scenario seems simple enough at first. Picture a lamp with a switch, and at the 1-minute mark before some deadline, you switch it on, then at the 30-second mark before the deadline, you switch it off, then at 15 seconds before the deadline, you switch it on again, and you continue this pattern with each interval being half the length of the previous one, switching the lamp on and off faster and faster as the deadline approaches. Mathematically, we can describe this infinite sequence and calculate that it will complete in exactly 2 minutes, yet when we reach that final moment, when the 2 minutes have elapsed and all infinite operations have supposedly finished, we face an impossible question. Is the lamp on or off? The paradox emerges because there is no final action to determine the lamp's state, no last switch to establish whether it ends in the on position or the off position, since every action is followed by another action in the infinite sequence, and no action is the final one. Our minds rebel against this because we are accustomed to thinking about processes as having definite endings and clear outcomes. Yet Thomson's lamp demonstrates that an infinite process, no matter how rapidly it accelerates, might not yield a determinate final state. Imagine you have an infinite collection of numbered balls, 1 through infinity, arranged in a container before you, and you begin a peculiar process that continues indefinitely into time. During the first step, you remove ball number 1 from the container while simultaneously adding 10 new balls numbered with a sequence that extends far beyond what was there before. In the second step, you remove ball number 2 and add 10 more balls to replace it. This process repeats continuously, each iteration removing one ball and adding 10 in its place, meaning that with every single step you perform, the total number of balls in your container increases by 9. After one step you have 9 balls, after 2 steps you have 18 balls, after 3 steps you have 27 balls, and this pattern continues infinitely upward. Yet here is where the paradox emerges in its full perplexing glory. If you were to somehow complete this infinite process and arrive at the end, the container would be completely empty. Every single ball you placed inside would have been removed at some point during your infinite sequence of actions. The mechanism underlying this impossible conclusion rests upon the counterintuitive properties of infinity itself, where the rate at which you remove items can eventually dominate the rate at which you add them, despite appearing negligible at every finite stage. The human mind struggles profoundly with this paradox because our everyday experience with finite quantities teaches us that adding more items than you remove should always result in accumulation. Yet infinity operates under entirely different mathematical rules that our intuition has never evolved to comprehend properly. This paradox ultimately reveals that infinity is not simply a larger version of finite sets, but rather operates under fundamentally different logical principles where our assumptions about accumulation and depletion cease to apply, forcing us to consider a simple sentence that refers to itself in a way that creates a logical knot. Yields a falsehood when preceded by its own quotation, yields a falsehood when preceded by its own quotation. When you read this sentence carefully, you begin to notice something deeply unsettling about how language can fold back on itself. The sentence makes a claim about what happens when you take a particular phrase and put that phrase's own quotation before it, and then the sentence does exactly that to itself, creating a self-referential loop that cannot be resolved into either truth or falsehood without contradiction. This is Quine's paradox, named after philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who discovered that you do not need the concept of truth and falsehood in the same sentence to create a logical impossibility, the way the liar's paradox does. You only need quotation and self-reference. The mechanism at work here involves the strange way that language can talk about itself while simultaneously being the thing it talks about. When we use quotation marks, we create a distinction between a word and what the word refers to, yet here that distinction collapses because the sentence is simultaneously the quoted phrase and the phrase doing the quoting. This creates a situation where the normal rules of logic cannot apply, because the sentence generates a contradiction regardless of whether we assign it the property of being true or being false. What makes this paradox particularly subtle and psychologically interesting is that it does not rely on the classical notion of truth the way most self-referential paradoxes do. Instead, it uses only the mechanical act of quotation and concatenation, which feel like purely formal, syntactic operations that should remain safely divorced from semantic paradox. Yet somehow, the formal structure itself generates the impossibility. Imagine standing before two separate gambling games, each one designed to make you lose money with absolute mathematical certainty. Game A involves flipping a coin where you lose slightly more often than you win, ensuring a gradual decline in your bankroll over time. Game B appears even worse at first glance, with losing odds that seem even more punishing than Game A, yet here is where the paradox emerges with stunning clarity. If you alternate between these two losing games, switching back and forth according to a specific pattern, you can somehow transform certain defeat into probable victory. By playing a losing game, then another losing game, and repeating this sequence, your overall winnings increase despite neither game offering any inherent advantage. This counterintuitive discovery emerged from physicist Juan Parando's mathematical analysis in the 1990s, revealing that two disadvantageous situations could combine to create advantage through their interaction. The mechanism operates because the games become correlated with your current wealth level, creating asymmetrical payoff structures that exploit the mathematical properties of probability and sequencing. When your bankroll reaches certain thresholds, the alternating pattern forces you into different probability landscapes where the games interact in unexpected ways. This creates a situation where the order and timing of losses actually matters more than the individual games themselves. We observe Parando's paradox throughout nature and human systems. Two mediocre business strategies combined become highly effective. Two unsuccessful relationships that inform future ones create wisdom. Two failing systems networked together produce surprising stability. The paradox persists in our collective understanding because we habitually evaluate options in isolation rather than examining how their interactions might transform outcomes entirely, leaving us perpetually surprised. Imagine standing outside on a clear night, gazing up at the vast expanse of darkness above you, where countless stars pierce through the black void like diamonds scattered across infinite velvet, and you begin to wonder why the night sky is not blindingly bright instead. This is the essence of Olber's paradox, a deceptively simple question that has troubled astronomers and philosophers for centuries. If the universe is infinite in size and populated with an infinite number of stars distributed uniformly throughout space, then why is the night sky dark at all? The logic seems irrefutable at first glance. If you look in any direction from Earth, your line of sight should eventually strike a star, and if stars are infinite and evenly dispersed, then every single direction you observe should terminate at a stellar surface, meaning the entire sky should blaze with the combined luminosity of countless suns, rendering darkness impossible. The paradox reveals itself through a straightforward mathematical principle. The number of stars within increasing distances from Earth grows proportionally to the square of that distance, while the brightness of each star diminishes according to the inverse square law, which means these two effects should perfectly cancel each other out, creating an equilibrium that would flood the universe with perpetual daylight. Yet when you step outside and look upward, you see predominantly darkness punctuated by isolated points of light, a contradiction that seems to violate the very foundations of astronomical calculation. The resolution of this paradox has evolved alongside our understanding of the cosmos itself. We now understand that the universe is not infinitely old, that it had a definite beginning approximately 13.8 billion years ago, and therefore we can only observe light from a finite region of space, the observable universe, beyond which we cannot see because the light from those distant regions has. Consider the fundamental nature of the physical world at its most basic level, where we observe that the laws governing individual particles and atoms operate in a way that is completely reversible in time, meaning that if you were to reverse the direction of time itself, these microscopic interactions would unfold in precisely the same manner according to the equations of physics. Yet when we examine the macroscopic world around us, the world we inhabit and experience directly through our senses, we observe that time has a very clear direction, that entropy increases, that disorder grows, and that processes are fundamentally irreversible. When you drop a cup of hot coffee on a cold floor, it does not spontaneously reassemble itself and warm back up. The heat dissipates permanently into the environment, and the cup remains broken. This is the profound contradiction at the heart of Loschmidt's paradox, identified by the Austrian physicist Joseph Loschmidt in the 19th century, who asked how it is possible that reversible microscopic laws could give rise to irreversible macroscopic phenomena. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of this paradox involves a kind of compartmentalization in our thinking, where we treat the world of atoms and molecules as fundamentally different from the world we perceive, accepting without deep examination that somehow the rules change at different scales. We have become comfortable with the notion that although individual particles follow reversible equations, the statistical behavior of trillions upon trillions of particles behaves in an irreversible manner, a resolution that relies on probability and the overwhelming likelihood of certain configurations over others. The paradox persists in our collective consciousness not because it remains unresolved in physics, but rather because the solution requires holding two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously, that the fundamental laws are. Imagine a surface that has only one side, a three-dimensional object that exists in our world, yet somehow defies the basic rules of geometry we learned in school. A bottle that contains itself without any opening or closing, a shape so paradoxical that it cannot exist in three-dimensional space without intersecting itself. Yet mathematicians have proven it is entirely real within the realm of four-dimensional mathematics. The Klein bottle is named after Felix Klein, the 19th century mathematician who first conceived of this impossible form, and it represents one of the most elegant contradictions in the field of topology. The paradox emerges from the fundamental nature of the bottle itself. It is a closed surface with no inside and no outside, meaning that if you were an ant walking on its surface, you could traverse from what appears to be the interior to what appears to be the exterior without ever crossing a boundary or falling off an edge. In three-dimensional space, we can create physical models of Klein bottles, but these representations necessarily intersect themselves, punching through their own walls in a way that would be impossible if the shape could exist unblemished in higher dimensions. What makes this truly paradoxical is that we accept these flawed three-dimensional representations as legitimate visualizations of something that is fundamentally perfect and complete in four dimensions, acknowledging simultaneously that our models are both accurate and incomplete, both true and false. We live with this contradiction comfortably, teaching it in universities and displaying it in museums, never troubled by the fact that we cannot fully perceive or construct the actual object we are studying, perhaps because the paradox serves as a humbling reminder that reality extends far beyond the dimensional prison of our sensory experience. Imagine a billionaire offers you $1 million with a single condition. You must form the intention to drink a deadly toxin tomorrow, though you will not actually drink it, because the billionaire will only give you the money today if you genuinely intend to poison yourself. But the toxin will make you violently ill for hours without killing you, and the billionaire will check your brain activity to confirm your sincere intention before handing over the money. The puzzle asks whether you can form this intention knowing you will never actually consume the poison, and whether doing so is even logically possible or rationally coherent. The paradox emerges because intention seems to require a commitment to actually perform an action, yet here you need only the intention without the action itself. Your rational mind recognizes that forming an intention to drink poison tomorrow serves no purpose, since you know the billionaire will pay you today regardless of what happens tomorrow, which means your intention tomorrow would be completely irrational and self-destructive. However, the puzzle suggests that perhaps you could form this intention anyway by some act of will, or by deceiving yourself about your future behavior, or by compartmentalizing your thoughts so deeply that part of you genuinely believes you will drink the toxin even though another part knows you will not. This philosophical problem reveals something peculiar about human intention and the relationship between our rational decision-making and our capacity to commit ourselves to future actions. We seem trapped between the logical impossibility of genuinely intending something we know we will never do, and the psychological difficulty of forming false intentions that our own minds can see through. Consider the fascinating phenomenon of how we classify numbers themselves as interesting or uninteresting, a distinction that creates a logical impossibility at the very heart of mathematics. If we were to attempt to list all the uninteresting numbers, numbers that possess no remarkable properties, no unique characteristics, and no reason to distinguish them from any other integer, we would quickly encounter a profound problem. The smallest number on such a list, the first genuinely uninteresting number, would immediately become interesting by virtue of being the smallest uninteresting number, which is itself a remarkable and distinguishing property. This single property would disqualify it from the uninteresting category entirely, bumping it from the list and promoting the next candidate to the position of smallest uninteresting number, which would then become interesting for the same reason, creating an endless logical loop that cannot be resolved. The paradox persists because we have created a definition that contains within itself the seeds of its own contradiction, much like trying to describe a colorless color or a silent sound. Every number, when examined carefully enough, possesses some quality that makes it noteworthy, whether mathematical, historical, cultural, or contextual, yet our minds resist accepting that all numbers might be interesting, as this seems to render the concept of interestingness meaningless. We have normalized this contradiction by simply accepting that some numbers feel interesting to us intuitively while others do not, bypassing the logical problem entirely through subjective judgment rather than objective classification, allowing us to live comfortably with a system that cannot actually exist in any coherent form. Imagine an infinitely large hotel with infinitely many rooms, each one occupied by a guest, and then a new guest arrives seeking accommodation. Yet somehow the hotel manager finds a way to make room for this newcomer, and then another arrives, and another still, and the manager continues to find solutions by shifting everyone to new rooms in ways that seem mathematically impossible in the finite world we inhabit. This is Hilbert's grand hotel paradox, a thought experiment conceived by mathematician David Hilbert to illustrate the deeply counterintuitive properties of infinity and how our finite minds struggle to grasp its true nature. The paradox reveals that with infinity, the whole is not necessarily greater than its parts, a fundamental violation of what we learned about quantity and containment in elementary mathematics, where adding one element to a set always creates a larger set. Yet infinity operates under entirely different rules, where you can add one item, or even infinitely many items, to an infinite collection and still maintain the same infinite magnitude. The psychological mechanism underlying our struggle with this paradox stems from our evolutionary experience in a finite world where our ancestors dealt only with countable, limited quantities of resources, predators, and companions. So our intuition about size and fullness is hardwired to finite logic, where a container filled to capacity cannot accept another item without first removing something else. Our brains expect hotels to work one way, space to function predictably, and infinity to behave like a very large number rather than an entirely different category of mathematical being. Yet infinity is not simply a bigger version of finite quantity, but rather a fundamentally alien concept that follows rules we must learn intellectually rather than intuitively understand through experience. Imagine the universe as a grand system of energy constantly transforming and redistributing itself across the cosmos, and yet simultaneously consider that this very process guarantees the universe's eventual descent into absolute stillness and silence, a state physicists call heat death, where all energy becomes uniformly distributed and no work can ever be performed again, no stars will burn, no life will exist. And yet we find ourselves existing right now in a moment of tremendous order and complexity that seems to defy this inevitable conclusion. The heat-death paradox emerges from a peculiar tension between two fundamental truths. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that entropy, or disorder, always increases in a closed system, meaning that the universe is fundamentally moving toward chaos and equilibrium, and yet we observe the opposite around us constantly, with intricate structures arising from simpler ones, with life emerging from non-life, with consciousness somehow crystallizing from the swirling chaos of matter and energy. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our difficulty in reconciling two different timescales and our natural human tendency to privilege the immediate present over the unimaginably distant future. For we are creatures who live and think in terms of decades and centuries at most, while the heat death of the universe lies trillions upon trillions of years away, so distant that it exists almost in the realm of myth rather than scientific prediction. We normalize this paradox by simply not thinking about it, by accepting that, yes, entropy increases, but also accepting that complexity and order emerge around us. And we do this without ever truly resolving the apparent contradiction, instead compartmentalizing these two understandings into separate mental boxes that we rarely attempt to reconcile. Consider the color emerald, a gem you have observed countless times throughout your life, gleaming green in sunlight and under artificial light, its verdant hue consistent across decades of human experience and scientific measurement. Yet imagine now a peculiar thought experiment proposed by philosopher Nelson Goodman, in which we introduce a property he called GRU, defined as anything that appears green before a certain future date, say the year 2500, and blue thereafter. And the moment you entertain this definition, you realize that every emerald you have ever seen could equally be described as GRU, since none of them have existed past our arbitrary cutoff date, and therefore you cannot actually distinguish between the hypothesis that emeralds are green and the hypothesis that they are GRU based solely on observation, despite these two properties seeming fundamentally different in every meaningful way. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something troubling about the nature of induction and language itself, for it demonstrates that we cannot logically justify why we project observed patterns into the future using some properties rather than others, and the only reason we assume emeralds will remain green rather than suddenly transform into blue at some distant point is that greenness is a simpler, more natural category that aligns with our intuitive understanding of how the world works, while gruness is artificial and constructed specifically for this thought experiment. Yet there exists no logical law of nature that actually prevents the universe from operating according to GRU principles. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is how we have normalized our reliance on linguistic convention and intuitive simplicity as substitutes for genuine logical justification, accepting without serious question that some properties are natural, while others are merely definitions we invented and we PR. Imagine you have two identical containers, each filled with the same gas at the same temperature and pressure, separated by a dividing wall. When you remove that wall and allow the gases to mix together, something peculiar happens in the mathematics of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that entropy, the measure of disorder in a system, must always increase when two different systems combine. According to classical calculations, when these two identical gases mix, the entropy of the combined system should increase substantially, as if something fundamentally new has occurred. However, here lies the profound puzzle that has haunted physicists for over a century. If the gases are truly identical in every conceivable way, with identical molecules moving at identical speeds in identical patterns, then nothing has actually changed at all. The gases cannot become more disordered because they were already in the same state before mixing as they are after. Yet the mathematics insists that entropy has increased, suggesting a violation of our logical intuitions about what entropy actually represents. The resolution of this paradox emerges when we consider the nature of identical particles in quantum mechanics and the philosophical boundaries of what we mean by distinguishability. At the quantum level, identical particles are not merely similar, they are fundamentally indistinguishable, and this indistinguishability must be accounted for in our calculations. The apparent entropy increase we calculate using classical methods comes from our inability to track which specific molecules came from which container, yet this is purely an informational limitation of our perspective, not a reflection of actual physical change. When we properly account for the indistinguishability of the gas molecules, the paradox vanishes entirely, and we recognize that no entropy increase occurs when identical substances mix. Imagine you are sitting in a quiet bar late on a Friday evening, and you observe something peculiar unfolding before you. There is a group of people gathered around a table, all of them engaged in what appears to be a simple drinking game or social challenge, and one person makes a statement that seems innocent enough on the surface. There exists at least one person in this bar who, if they drink, then everyone in this bar drinks. Now, this statement might sound absurd at first, perhaps even impossible, yet the drinker paradox insists that this statement must logically be true in every single scenario you can possibly imagine, regardless of whether all the patrons are drinking or none of them are, or whether they fall somewhere in between. The paradox works through a peculiar form of logical reasoning that hinges on the principle of material implication, which is a foundational concept in formal logic where an if-then statement is considered true whenever the condition either fails to be met or the consequence is satisfied. When you apply this principle to the scenario at the bar, you find that if everyone is already drinking, then any person you select will satisfy the statement, because if that person drinks, then everyone drinks, which is already true. However, and this is where the paradox becomes genuinely puzzling, even if not everyone is drinking, the statement somehow still holds true, because there must exist at least one person who is not drinking, and for that non-drinker, the statement becomes vacuously true, meaning that the if-then condition is satisfied simply because the condition itself is false. The psychological mechanism that makes this paradox so mind-bending is that our intuitive understanding of causality and logical implication breaks down when confronted with this scenario, because we naturally think of if-then statements as describing causal relationships where one thing causes another, yet the drinker paradox reveals T. Imagine you find yourself unemployed and desperately seeking work, only to discover that nearly every job posting requires you to have prior experience in that exact field. Yet you cannot gain that experience without first being hired by someone willing to take a chance on you, creating an impossible loop where the requirement to get the job is the very thing you need the job to obtain. This is the essence of a catch-22 situation, a paradox where you are trapped between two mutually dependent conditions that make forward progress logically impossible. The mechanism works like this. To solve problem A, you must first solve problem B, but solving problem B requires that problem A already be solved, leaving you frozen in a state of circular dependency with no legitimate entry point. The paradox takes its name from Joseph Heller's novel, where a bombardier could be excused from flying dangerous missions if he was insane, yet the very act of asking to be excused proved he was sane enough to know the danger, thus disqualifying him from the exemption. What makes this paradox so psychologically fascinating is that it exposes the arbitrary nature of many rules and systems we have constructed, yet we continue to enforce them with unwavering certainty. A recent graduate cannot gain experience because employers demand experience. A person cannot afford therapy because they cannot work due to mental health issues. Someone cannot get a loan because they have no credit history, yet building credit requires taking out loans. We have normalized these impossible situations so thoroughly that we rarely question whether the systems themselves are flawed rather than the individuals caught within them. The catch-22 persists not because it is logically necessary, but because institutions have become self-perpetuating machines that follow rules without examining whether those rules serve their intended purpose, and by the time we recognize we are trapped, the circle. Imagine a scenario where a child grows up in a household without access to educational resources, without tutoring, without the social connections that lead to internships, and without the financial stability that allows them to take unpaid opportunities that build a resume. And yet we tell this child that their failure to succeed is simply a matter of personal willpower and determination. As though pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps is a physically possible act rather than a metaphorical impossibility that defies the actual mechanics of how human beings advance through society. The bootstrap theory suggests that success is entirely within an individual's control, that anyone with enough discipline and motivation can overcome any circumstance, regardless of whether the actual infrastructure for advancement exists within their reach. What makes this paradox so insidious is not merely that it ignores systemic realities, but that it psychologically inverts causality by suggesting that those who fail to succeed have simply failed to want it badly enough, when in fact the distribution of opportunity is fundamentally unequal and predetermined by factors entirely outside individual control. We have normalized this inverted logic so thoroughly that people who benefit from tremendous advantages genuinely believe their success is purely earned, while simultaneously believing that those without advantages simply lack sufficient determination. The mechanism persists because it allows successful people to maintain a flattering self-image while avoiding the cognitive dissonance of acknowledging that luck, timing, and inherited advantages played significant roles in their outcomes. We continue to perpetuate bootstrap mythology in our culture despite overwhelming evidence that socioeconomic mobility has stagnated, that geography determines opportunity, and that the circumstances of one's birth remain one of the strongest predictors of one's future, because imagine you are shown a photograph of a face that appears perfectly normal at first glance, and yet when that same photograph is flipped upside down, something deeply unsettling occurs within your perception, something that defies the basic logic of how you understand visual recognition. This is the Thatcher effect, a peculiar phenomenon in which faces that have been grotesquely distorted, with eyes and mouths moved to bizarre positions or inverted while the rest of the face remains upright, appear far less disturbing when viewed in their normal orientation than they do when rotated 180 degrees. The effect was first documented in 1980 when British researcher Peter Thomson presented subjects with deliberately manipulated photographs of former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and the discovery revealed something profoundly strange about the architecture of human facial recognition. When you look at a face right side up, your brain processes it as a whole, as a gestalt, engaging sophisticated neural systems that recognize faces holistically and detect minute emotional and structural details with remarkable precision. However, when that same face is flipped upside down, your brain seems to abandon this efficient, holistic approach and instead processes the face in a more fragmented, detail-oriented manner, examining individual features in isolation rather than as an integrated whole. This shift in processing strategy means that grotesque distortions in individual features become far more apparent and disturbing when the face is upright, because you are detecting them as violations of the complete facial structure you recognize. Yet when that face is inverted, your brain fails to notice how severely those features have been manipulated, because it is no longer comparing them against your deeply ingrained template of what a normal face should look like. Imagine a cube drawn on paper, rendered in three-dimensional perspective with clean lines and careful shading, a representation so convincing that your mind momentarily accepts it as a three-dimensional object you could theoretically hold in your hand. Yet as you trace your eye around its edges, you begin to notice something deeply unsettling about its geometry. The lines connect in ways that should be impossible, where corners meet at angles that defy the laws of spatial logic, where edges that appear to recede into the background simultaneously project forward into the foreground, creating a structure that your brain insists must exist while your logical mind absolutely refuses to accept its validity. This is the impossible cube, also known as the Necker cube when rendered with ambiguous depth, a visual paradox that highlights the profound gap between what we perceive and what can actually exist in three-dimensional space. The mechanism behind this cognitive distortion stems from how your visual cortex processes information, assembling flat two-dimensional patterns into three-dimensional mental models without always verifying whether those models obey the fundamental rules of Euclidean geometry. Your brain evolved to make rapid assessments of spatial relationships for survival purposes, and this system works excellently for navigating the real world. But when presented with carefully crafted visual ambiguities, it applies its usual interpretation strategies to patterns that deliberately violate physical possibility. The impossible cube persists in our collective consciousness not because we are foolish or perceptually broken, but because the very mechanisms that allow us to see depth and form in two-dimensional images are so automatic and unconscious that we cannot easily override them. Imagine yourself standing at the bottom of a staircase, looking upward at an architectural structure that appears perfectly normal at first glance, with each step rising higher than the last in a logical progression that your eyes can follow with ease. You begin to climb, placing one foot in front of the other, moving upward with purpose and intention, feeling the steady elevation beneath your feet as you ascend higher and higher into the structure. Yet after what feels like an eternity of climbing, of continuously moving your body in an upward direction through space and effort, you find yourself arriving at the exact same location where you began, standing once again at the bottom of the staircase, having completed a full rotation through what should have been an impossible geometric configuration. The Penrose stairs, created by the mathematician Roger Penrose in 1958, represent a visual paradox that exploits the fundamental limitations of two-dimensional representation, attempting to describe three-dimensional space. When rendered as a drawing or viewed in a photograph, the staircase appears to climb continuously and logically, with each subsequent step visibly higher than the previous one, creating an irrefutable sense of ascending motion that your brain readily accepts and processes. The mechanism behind this deception lies in the way our visual system interprets depth, perspective, and spatial relationships based on incomplete information and learned assumptions about how three-dimensional objects should appear when flattened onto a two-dimensional surface. Our brains make unconscious calculations about distance, angle, and elevation based on size relationships, overlap, and perspective cues. Assumptions that work perfectly well in the real world but fail catastrophically when confronted with carefully constructed geometric impossibilities. Imagine listening to a sound that appears to continuously ascend in pitch, climbing higher and higher without ever reaching a peak, maintaining an endless upward trajectory that should theoretically become inaudible as it approaches the upper limits of human hearing, and yet somehow it never does, never plateaus, never becomes uncomfortably shrill, but instead seems to perpetually rise into an impossible sonic space where no sound should logically exist. This auditory illusion, created by composer Jean-Claude Risset and later popularized through the work of psychologist Roger Shepard, consists of multiple sine wave tones layered atop one another across different octaves, each separated by precisely one octave, with each individual tone gradually increasing in volume while simultaneously decreasing in frequency in a carefully orchestrated mathematical relationship that creates a continuous rising motion. The mechanism that produces this paradox relies on the human auditory system's peculiar sensitivity to octave equivalence, a fundamental principle in music perception where the same note played across different octaves maintains its essential character and identity. So when one tone fades out at the top of the audible range while another fades in at the bottom, our brains perceive this transition as seamless continuation rather than a discrete jump or loop, interpreting the overall complex as a single unified pitch that perpetually ascends without ever resolving or reaching completion. Despite our intellectual understanding that this ascending trajectory must inevitably conclude, must somehow reset and return to its starting point, must cycle back upon itself in a continuous loop, the sensation of endless rising persists with remarkable psychological tenacity, creating a cognitive dissonance between what we rationally know must be occurring and what our perceptual apparatus insists is actually happening, leaving us suspended in an uncomforta. Imagine watching a video of someone speaking a particular syllable, but the audio you hear does not match what their lips are clearly forming. You watch their mouth shape the sounds of ba ba ba, yet your ears detect fa fa fa, and what your brain ultimately perceives and reports is something entirely different, perhaps, a phantom sound that exists nowhere in the actual sensory input you received. This is the McGurk effect, a phenomenon first documented in 1976 by Harry McGurk and John MacDonald, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about the relationship between perception and reality. The paradox emerges when you consider that you possess two independent sensory streams delivering contradictory information simultaneously. And rather than experiencing confusion or becoming aware of the conflict, your brain simply manufactures a third option that satisfies neither input but feels entirely natural and convincing. The mechanism underlying this effect operates through what neuroscientists call multisensory integration, a process in which the brain does not treat vision and hearing as separate channels that require careful arbitration, but rather fuses them together into a single perceptual experience at a fundamental level. Your visual cortex processes the lip movements, your auditory cortex processes the sound waves, and somewhere in the depths of your superior temporal sulcus, these signals are weighted and combined according to rules your brain has learned through a lifetime of natural conversation, where visual and auditory information almost always agree. When they disagree artificially, your brain does not declare a stalemate or heighten your awareness to the contradiction. Instead, it lanes on whichever signal appears more reliable in that context and constructs a perception that makes sense of both. Imagine listening to two musical notes played in sequence, one after the other, separated by what musicians call a tritone interval, which is the most dissonant and unsettling distance between any two notes in Western music theory. Now imagine that both of these notes are played in different octaves simultaneously, creating an auditory illusion where your brain cannot definitively determine whether the second note is higher or lower than the first one, even though physically and mathematically one note is objectively higher in pitch than the other. When you listen to this tritone paradox, created and studied extensively by psychologist Diana Deutsch, something peculiar happens inside your mind. Different listeners will hear the sequence moving in opposite directions, and remarkably, if you play the exact same pair of notes in reverse order, you will hear it moving in the same direction it was going before, which should be impossible according to the laws of physics and acoustics. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates at the intersection of how your brain processes pitch information and how it interprets the perception of height and direction in sound. Your auditory system relies on multiple overlapping frequency components and your personal listening history to determine pitch. And because the tritone sits perfectly at the midpoint between octaves, your brain cannot anchor itself to a clear reference point, causing it to construct conflicting interpretations of which note is truly higher. Different people's brains resolve this ambiguity in different ways based on their musical training, their native language, and the specific neural pathways that have strengthened throughout their lifetime, which explains why some people consistently hear the notes ascending while others hear them descending, and why playing the sequence backward produces the paradoxical effect of sounding like it continues in the same direction rather than reversing. Imagine standing on a beach with a map, trying to measure the exact length of the coastline stretching before you, and then imagine that every time you use a more detailed measuring tool, the answer changes dramatically and grows longer, endlessly longer, with no final answer ever emerging no matter how precise your instruments become. This is the coastline paradox, a phenomenon discovered by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot in the 1960s, which reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of measurement itself and the boundaries we assume are fixed and definable. When you measure a coastline with a ruler on a map, you get one number, perhaps 500 kilometers. But when you walk along that same coast with a measuring tape and account for every small bay and rocky outcropping, the length becomes 2,000 kilometers. Then, if you zoom in further with even more sophisticated equipment to measure around individual pebbles and grains of sand, the coastline becomes impossibly long, stretching toward infinity with each magnification. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the fractal nature of coastlines, wherein the boundary between land and sea contains infinite complexity at every scale of observation, with smaller and smaller details repeating patterns at magnifications both visible and invisible to the human eye. The coastline has no true objective length because length itself depends entirely on the resolution at which you choose to measure it, making any answer simultaneously correct and incomplete depending on your perspective and tools. We have normalized this paradox by simply choosing conventional measurement scales and agreeing not to look too closely, accepting arbitrary answers like the official lengths governments assign to their coastlines, while ignoring the infinite complexity lurking in the spaces between our chosen units of measurement. Imagine you walk into a room with 23 people gathered together, perhaps at a casual office party or a small classroom setting, and someone asks a simple question. What are the odds that at least two people in this room share the same birthday? Most people's intuition would suggest the probability is quite low, perhaps somewhere around 10 or 15%, because there are 365 possible days in a year, and 23 people seems like a small fraction of that total. Yet the actual probability that two people share a birthday in this scenario is just over 50%, meaning it is more likely than not that a match exists. This is the birthday paradox, and it persists as one of the most counterintuitive findings in probability theory because our minds are fundamentally poor at calculating combinatorial mathematics in real time. When we think about birthdays, we imagine one person and ask what the chance is that someone else shares their specific date, which feels unlikely. But the paradox emerges because we are not asking about one specific birthday. We are asking whether any pair among all possible pairs shares a birthday, and the number of possible pairs grows exponentially rather than linearly. With 23 people, there are 253 unique pairs that could potentially match. And even though each individual pair has a low probability of matching, the sheer quantity of pairs makes a collision inevitable. This mathematical reality demonstrates how our brains default to linear thinking when the actual structure of a problem is exponential. And we continue to be surprised by this result even after learning about it, because our intuition does not naturally update to account for combinatorial growth in the way that formal mathematics demands. Consider for a moment the peculiar observation that your friends, on average, have more friends than you do, and this paradox holds true for nearly everyone who stops to examine their own social network with honest scrutiny. When you look at the people you call your closest friends, you will likely notice that most of them seem to have larger social circles than your own. They appear to know more people, they receive more invitations to gatherings, and they occupy more central positions within the various communities you inhabit together. This phenomenon is not a reflection of your social inadequacy or some personal failing on your part, but rather a mathematical inevitability that emerges from the way human friendship networks are naturally structured. The mechanism behind this paradox is fundamentally rooted in a sampling bias that operates at the unconscious level of how we form our social bonds. When you become friends with someone, you are inherently more likely to befriend individuals who already possess larger networks, because people with more connections simply have more opportunities to meet you and forge relationships with you in the first place. Those isolated individuals with very few friends contribute almost nothing to your circle, while highly social people with vast networks are disproportionately represented among your own friends. This creates a systematic skew where the average friend in your network will inevitably have more friends than you, since the popular people appear multiple times in this calculation, while the lonely ones barely register. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how it persists in our consciousness despite our intellectual understanding of its mathematical foundation, and how we have collectively normalized the discomfort of watching our friends navigate social landscapes that seem perpetually larger and more vibrant than our own. Imagine you're examining data about two hospitals and their patient survival rates, and you discover something that seems impossible. Hospital A has a higher survival rate than Hospital B when you look at each type of surgery separately. Yet when you combine all the data together, Hospital B suddenly appears to have the better overall survival rate. This reversal of comparison when data is aggregated is Simpson's paradox, and it reveals how the same statistical truth can contradict itself depending on how you organize the numbers. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in what statisticians call confounding variables, which are hidden factors that influence the data in ways we don't immediately notice. In the hospital example, Hospital B might receive more patients with less severe conditions overall, while Hospital A treats the most critical cases, and these underlying differences in patient populations can completely reshape what the aggregated numbers tell us when we're not paying close attention to the granular details. The paradox persists because our minds naturally want to see data as objective truth, assuming that larger datasets and combined numbers are somehow more reliable and truthful than smaller segments, when in reality, the composition and structure of that data matters far more than its size. We've normalized this selective view of statistics in everyday discourse, accepting conclusions from combined data without questioning whether the groups being combined are actually comparable or whether some hidden variable is silently distorting our conclusions about causality and truth. When a pharmaceutical company reports that their new drug works better overall across their patient population, but actually performs worse in every relevant subgroup, elderly patients, younger patients, those with comorbidities, we're witnessing Simpson's paradox in action, a deception that can be entirely unintentional yet profoundly misleading. Imagine a city planner who observes heavy traffic congestion on the main routes during rush hour and decides that the solution is to build a new road that connects two previously disconnected areas, creating a shortcut that should theoretically offer drivers an alternative path and reduce overall travel times for everyone on the network. The planners run their models, the engineers approve the designs, and the new road is constructed with great fanfare and public investment. Yet when the road opens and drivers begin using it, something unexpected happens. The average commute time across the entire network actually increases, making the situation worse than it was before the new road was built. This counterintuitive outcome is Bries's paradox, named after the German mathematician Dietrich Bries, who discovered it in 1968. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through the selfish routing behavior of individual drivers who each attempt to minimize their own travel time without considering the collective impact of their choices. When the new road becomes available, drivers rationally choose to use it because it appears faster for their individual journey, but as more and more drivers make this same rational individual decision, they create new bottlenecks and congestion on the previously underutilized shortcut, which ultimately forces traffic from the originally efficient routes and redistributes it in a way that creates worse overall system performance. The paradox persists in real transportation networks, urban planning, telecommunication systems, and even in economic markets, because we continue to operate under the assumption that adding resources or options always improves outcomes, when in fact the introduction of new choices in complex interdependent systems can fundamentally alter the equilibrium in unexpected ways that harm collective welfare while appearing beneficial at the individual level. Imagine a sweltering summer afternoon in Texas where a family sits together in an air-conditioned home, perfectly content in their comfort, when one family member suggests taking a trip to Abilene, a distant town roughly 50 miles away known for its unremarkable diner. The suggestion is made somewhat casually, perhaps with a hint of boredom, yet each family member agrees to go, climbing into a hot car for hours of driving through dust and heat, only to arrive at a disappointing destination where they eat mediocre food and spend time together in discomfort, all the while secretly wishing they had remained home. Upon returning, exhausted and irritated, someone finally asks why anyone agreed to such an unpleasant journey, and to everyone's astonishment, each person reveals they never actually wanted to go but agreed only because they believed the others wanted to go, creating a situation where everyone participated in something nobody wanted to do, simply because they misread the room and assumed consensus existed when in fact it did not. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a fear of social rejection combined with a misplaced sense of obligation to group harmony, where each individual prioritizes what they perceive as collective preference over their own authentic desires, assuming that voicing disagreement might appear selfish or create conflict, so they suppress their true feelings and manufacture agreement instead. This pattern persists because most humans are deeply wired for social cohesion and fear the potential ostracism that might result from standing apart from the group, even when that group itself harbors identical doubts but remains equally silent. What makes this paradox so peculiar is that it demonstrates how groups can collectively engage in actions that serve nobody's interests and contradict everyone's actual preferences, yet persist because of mutual misunderstanding and the silent compliance of. Imagine sitting in front of a computer while a robot arm attempts to pick up a wooden block from a table, fumbling awkwardly with its mechanical joints, overcompensating with servo motors that whir and strain as it struggles with a task that any 5-year-old child performs effortlessly without conscious thought. Meanwhile, that same computer can defeat the world's greatest chess champion, solve complex mathematical equations in seconds, and recall millions of facts with perfect accuracy. Yet the robot still cannot reliably tie a shoelace or navigate a crowded room without collision detection sensors working overtime. This observation forms the core of Moravec's paradox, named after computer scientist Hans Moravec, which reveals a profound inversion in the relationship between computational difficulty and human perception of difficulty. The paradox states that tasks requiring high-level reasoning and conscious deliberation, such as playing chess or solving abstract logic problems, are actually easier to automate than tasks requiring sensory-motor skills and intuitive understanding, such as walking, grasping objects, or recognizing faces in cluttered environments. The mechanism underlying this inversion stems from the evolutionary timeline of human development and cognition itself. Our conscious reasoning abilities evolved relatively recently in evolutionary terms, perhaps only a few million years ago, whereas our sensory-motor systems have been refined over hundreds of millions of years through countless iterations of natural selection. Conscious reasoning, therefore, operates through explicit rules and logical steps that can be translated into algorithms, while sensory-motor skills operate through deeply embedded neural patterns that developed through embodied experience in physical space. Imagine a donkey standing perfectly equidistant between two identical piles of hay, each equally appetizing, each positioned at exactly the same distance from where the animal stands. The donkey experiences genuine hunger and possesses a genuine desire to eat, yet it cannot decide which pile to approach because there exists no rational reason to prefer one over the other. According to the paradox, named after the 14th century philosopher Jean Baradin, the donkey would remain frozen in this position indefinitely, unable to move in either direction, and would eventually starve to death while surrounded by abundant food. The paradox emerges from a fundamental question about decision-making and free will. If two options are perfectly identical and equally desirable, how can any rational agent choose between them? The logical problem suggests that without some differentiating factor, without some reason that tilts the scales even slightly in one direction, a purely rational being should be incapable of action. Yet here we encounter something profoundly strange about existence itself. In reality, animals do not behave this way at all. A real donkey faced with two identical hay piles would simply begin eating from one, perhaps due to minute environmental variations, subtle asymmetries in position, or completely random neurological factors that introduce just enough variance to break the tie. The human mind faces this same invisible problem constantly. When we must choose between two nearly identical options with no clear rational advantage, we experience a peculiar paralysis that feels almost supernatural. We flip coins, we guess, we delay, we create artificial reasons to prefer one choice over another, all because our brains somehow understand that pure logic cannot resolve genuine symmetry. Imagine a crocodile that has swallowed a person whole, and that person is still alive inside the crocodile's stomach. The crocodile then approaches you and makes a peculiar promise. If you can correctly guess whether the crocodile will release the person from its belly or keep them trapped inside forever, then the crocodile will honor your prediction by doing exactly what you said. However, if you guess incorrectly, the crocodile will do the opposite of what you predicted. This ancient paradox forces you into a logical trap from which there is no escape, because any answer you provide creates an internal contradiction that undermines the very foundation of the crocodile's promise. If you predict the crocodile will release the person, and you are correct, then the crocodile must release them, which validates your prediction and creates consistency. But if you predict the crocodile will release them, and you are wrong, then the crocodile must do the opposite and keep them imprisoned, which means your prediction was actually correct, creating an impossibility. The crocodile cannot simultaneously honor a correct prediction while also punishing it as though it were incorrect. This paradox emerges from the self-referential nature of the game itself, where your prediction directly influences the outcome in a way that either confirms or denies its own accuracy. The mechanism at work here involves a logical loop that cannot be resolved through reason alone, much like the liar's paradox, where a statement declares its own falsity. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how it reveals the limits of certainty and prediction when systems contain self-referential elements. We encounter these logical knots in everyday situations without recognizing them, in promises that depend on outcomes we cannot control, in guarantees that undermine themselves through their own conditions, creating scenarios where commitment and contradiction become indistinguishable. Consider the adjective short, a word that describes things of limited length or duration, yet the word itself contains 5 letters and takes up a reasonable amount of space when written or spoken, making it arguably not short at all. Now consider the word polysyllabic, which contains 4 syllables and thus demonstrates the very property it describes, thereby being genuinely polysyllabic in nature. This distinction creates the foundation for one of mathematics and linguistics' most elegant logical traps, the Grelling-Nelson paradox, which asks us to examine words that either possess or do not possess the qualities they describe. The paradox emerges when we create a category for autological words, those self-descriptive terms that apply to themselves, and heterological words, those that do not. We might classify English as heterological since the word itself is not English, but rather a linguistic label, though written in English characters. We might call monosyllabic heterological because the word itself contains 4 syllables rather than 1. Yet the moment we ask whether the word heterological is itself heterological or autological, we find ourselves trapped in an impossible logical loop, much like asking whether a barber who shaves all men who do not shave themselves should shave himself. If heterological is heterological, then by definition it must be autological, which contradicts our classification. If heterological is autological, then it must apply to itself, making it heterological by definition. The paradox persists because we have created a system of language classification that contains an internal contradiction at its very foundation, similar to how we might build a mathematical system only to discover it devours its own premises. Imagine a mathematician sitting at a desk, tasked with the seemingly simple job of defining all the real numbers that can be described using the English language in a finite number of words. And as she works through this exercise, she begins to notice something deeply unsettling about the very nature of what she is attempting to accomplish. Richard's paradox emerges when we consider the set of all real numbers that are definable in English using only a finite sequence of words, a collection that would seem perfectly reasonable to construct until we begin to examine the logical consequences of our definition itself. The paradox presents itself through a deceptively elegant construction. If we can enumerate all the finite English descriptions of real numbers, we can create a new number by taking the diagonal of this enumeration and modifying each digit, much like Cantor's diagonal argument. Yet this newly created number, which we have just defined in English through a finite description, somehow cannot exist within our original enumeration because it is defined in terms of that very enumeration. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our intuitive assumption that anything we can describe in language must be part of the set we are describing, combined with the mathematical principle that any construction we create must be subject to the same rules as the system in which we created it, resulting in a strange loop where our definition becomes self-referential and paradoxical. This paradox persists because we have normalized the distinction between language and mathematics without fully acknowledging the deep tension between descriptive power and mathematical completeness, allowing us to speak casually about definable numbers without recognizing that the very act of defining something creates a meta-level consideration that can collapse the logical framework we are using, and thus we continue to work with these concepts as though the Imagine a librarian tasked with cataloging all English words that can be meaningfully described by themselves, and she creates a list of such self-descriptive terms, words like polysyllabic, which is itself polysyllabic, or English, which is an English word. Then she decides to create a second list containing all the words that cannot be described by themselves, words like monosyllabic, which is decidedly not monosyllabic, or French, which is not a French word. Now consider what happens when she attempts to classify the phrase itself, the very description used to identify membership in that second list, the phrase that names all words not self-descriptive, and she realizes she has constructed a linguistic trap from which there is no escape. If the phrase belongs in the second list, then by definition it describes itself, which would mean it must belong to the first list instead. Yet if it belongs to the first list, then it is self-descriptive, which means it accurately describes something that belongs in the second list, placing it back where it started. The paradox emerges not from any flaw in logic itself, but from the dangerous intersection of language and self-reference, where words attempt to contain their own definitions while simultaneously remaining meaningful. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals how our linguistic systems, which ordinarily serve as reliable tools for categorization and meaning-making, become unstable when they turn inward to examine themselves. Language evolved as a system for describing external reality, yet we have gradually extended its reach to encompass abstract concepts, logical principles, and eventually the system of language itself, creating recursive loops where the map attempts to contain itself while remaining legible. Imagine a sentence that reads, "If this sentence is true, then the universe is made of cheese." Now consider that if we accept the sentence as true, then by its own logic, the consequent must follow, meaning the universe would indeed be made of cheese. This is the essence of Curry's paradox, a self-referential logical trap that creates a strange loop of reasoning where we can seemingly prove anything is true, no matter how absurd, simply by constructing the right sentence structure. The paradox emerges from a fundamental tension between how we understand truth and reference within language itself. When a statement refers to its own truth value and uses conditional logic, it creates a peculiar bootstrapping effect where assuming the statement is true forces us to accept whatever conclusion it proposes, regardless of reality. This mechanism works because we've built our logical systems on the assumption that true sentences can be reliably identified and manipulated, yet Curry's construction exposes a gap in that foundation. The paradox persists in our thinking despite lacking any resolution because it reveals something uncomfortable about self-reference and logical systems. We cannot easily distinguish between a sentence that genuinely conveys information about the world and a sentence that merely performs a logical sleight of hand on itself. We continue to encounter variations of this problem in programming, mathematics, and formal logic, where recursive definitions and self-reference remain surprisingly difficult to police, suggesting that the paradox isn't merely a curiosity, but reflects something deep and unresolved about how meaning and truth interact. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is that any logical system powerful enough to express self-reference may be fundamentally vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, suggesting that the paradox isn't a flaw we can patch, but rather an inherent feature of sufficiently complex reasoning itself. Consider for a moment the strange experience of uttering these words aloud. "It is raining outside, but I do not believe that it is raining." The sentence itself contains no logical contradiction in the way that saying, "It is both raining and not raining," would contain one, and yet something about the statement feels profoundly absurd and self-defeating in a way that troubles the mind. This is Moore's paradox, named after the 20th century philosopher George Edward Moore, who first identified this peculiar phenomenon of language and belief. What makes this paradox so fascinating is that while the statement commits no logical error, it commits what philosophers call a performative contradiction, which is to say that in the act of asserting the first part of the statement, you simultaneously undermine the credibility of the second part through the very act of speaking. If you genuinely believed it was raining, you would simply say it is raining, and the addition of your denial of that belief renders the entire utterance incoherent in practice, even if not in pure logic. The paradox reveals a deep asymmetry between what we can assert as true in language and what we can rationally assert while maintaining consistency between our words and our apparent mental states. We find ourselves unable to meaningfully communicate such a statement to another person because the listener would immediately perceive a contradiction not in the logical structure, but in the apparent relationship between the speaker's knowledge and their expression of doubt. This paradox persists in our language even though we understand intellectually that no formal law of logic has been violated, suggesting that human communication operates under unspoken rules that go beyond mere logical consistency, rules that demand alignment between what we claim about the world and what we claim about our own minds regarding that world. Consider a scenario where you discover some fact about the world that is true but entirely unknown to anyone, perhaps a detail about an ancient civilization or a secret kept buried in the earth for millennia. Now imagine that you learn this fact and decide to tell someone else about it, making it known. According to Fitch's paradox, this seemingly innocent act of sharing information creates a logical contradiction that challenges our understanding of knowledge itself. The paradox operates on a deceptively simple foundation. If a statement is true and unknown, then it must be possible for something true to remain unknown, yet the moment you make that truth known to another person, you have created a situation where you now know something that was previously unknown, which seems to suggest that unknown truths can become known through the simple act of communication. The logical mechanism that drives this paradox emerges from the interaction between two fundamental principles of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge itself. The first principle states that if you know something, then that something must be true, a concept called the factivity of knowledge. The second principle suggests that if a proposition is knowable, then it is possible for someone to actually know it. The paradox arises when we ask whether every true statement is knowable, because if we accept that every truth can potentially be known, then every truth must currently be known by someone, somewhere, or at least be knowable in principle. This creates a tension between the intuitive notion that some truths might exist without anyone knowing them, and the logical framework that says, if something is true and knowable, it should be knowable. The paradox persists in philosophical discourse despite decades of analysis, because it touches on something deeply uncertain about the nature of knowledge itself, revealing that our ordinary assumptions about truth and knowledge may contie. Consider the curious experience of opening a book and encountering its preface, that introductory section written by the author after the manuscript is complete, yet positioned before the story begins, and notice how this temporal inversion creates a peculiar dissonance in our reading experience. The preface exists in a strange liminal space where the author speaks to us about a work that has already been finished, yet we have not yet encountered it, meaning the author is reflecting backward about something we have not yet moved forward through, creating a reversed chronology of knowledge and revelation. When we read a preface, we are absorbing commentary, context, and sometimes even spoilers about a narrative we have not yet experienced. Yet we accept this arrangement as perfectly natural and standard, despite the fact that it fundamentally violates the narrative principle of discovery. The mechanism underlying this paradox involves our willingness to accept authorial authority and structural convention as superseding logical sequence, because we trust that the author knows best how to prepare us for their work, even if that preparation contains information that technically undermines our first encounter with the material. We have collectively normalized this backward-facing introduction so thoroughly that most readers never question why a preface should exist at all, or why we permit ourselves to be guided through interpretive frameworks before we have independently formed our own impressions of the text itself. The author writes the preface last, after knowing exactly how the narrative concludes and which themes emerged, yet presents it first, asking us to walk through their artistic conclusions before experiencing the artistic journey that led to those conclusions. Imagine you are standing in a convenience store, looking at a lottery ticket with 6 numbers printed across its face, and you must decide whether to believe that your particular ticket will lose. The lottery organizers have sold 10 million tickets for this drawing, and only one will win the jackpot, which means the probability that your specific ticket will lose is extraordinarily high, somewhere around 0.999999 in mathematical terms. This seems like the most rational conclusion you could possibly reach, a straightforward application of probability theory that any reasonable person should accept without hesitation. Yet at the same moment you hold this conviction about your own ticket's inevitable loss, you somehow maintain a contradictory belief that someone will definitely win this lottery, that one ticket out of those 10 million will emerge victorious with the announced prize money. This is the essential puzzle of the lottery paradox, a problem that reveals a peculiar crack in how we apply rational reasoning to collective versus individual cases. The mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from the way our minds compartmentalize probability across different scales of analysis. When we examine the lottery as a system, we recognize with complete certainty that the lottery must produce a winner because that is simply how lotteries are constructed and operated. The mathematical guarantee holds firm at this macro level of reasoning. But when we zoom into the individual level and examine your ticket alongside millions of others, each one possesses such a vanishingly small probability of winning that rationality seems to demand we reject the possibility entirely for each individual case. We cannot rationally believe that your ticket will win, or that my ticket will win, or that anyone else's ticket will win, yet we cannot deny that someone's ticket absolutely will win. Imagine you are standing at one end of a room and you wish to walk to the other side. Before you can reach your destination, you must first traverse half the distance to get there. But before you can cover that first half, you must cover half of that distance, and before covering that half, you must cover half of that distance, and so on infinitely into smaller and smaller intervals. This creates an infinite series of distances that must be traveled, each one requiring its own traversal, its own moment of completion. Since you cannot complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time, the logic suggests you should never be able to reach the other side of the room at all, yet you know from experience that you do walk across rooms every single day without hesitation or difficulty. The paradox, first formulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea around 2,500 years ago, presents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of motion, distance, and the nature of infinity itself. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in how we conceptualize continuous motion and infinite divisibility. Mathematically, we now understand that an infinite series of numbers can indeed sum to a finite value, a concept that would not be fully formalized until the development of calculus centuries later. Our minds struggle with this because we tend to think of infinity as something that cannot be completed, yet mathematics reveals that infinite subdivisions of space can occupy finite distances. What makes this paradox persist in our consciousness is that despite knowing intellectually that we move through space constantly and successfully, the logical argument still produces a nagging sense of unease when we contemplate it carefully, as though we are witnessing a flaw in reality itself rather than merely a limitation in how we frame the question of motion and infinity. Imagine an arrow in flight, moving through the air from one place to another, and consider what it means for that arrow to be moving at any given instant in time. At any single moment, that arrow occupies a specific position in space, and if we examine that instant closely enough, the arrow is not moving at all during that infinitesimal slice of time because there is no duration for movement to occur. The arrow exists at point A at that moment, and it is at rest in that location, frozen in time just as a photograph freezes a moment. If this is true for every single instant throughout the arrow's flight, then the arrow must be at rest during every moment of its trajectory, which seems to suggest that the arrow never actually moves at all, and yet we observe the arrow traveling across space with our own eyes. This ancient paradox, attributed to the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, creates a fundamental tension between what we perceive as continuous motion and what logic seems to tell us about the nature of time and position. The mechanism underlying this puzzle involves our assumptions about the structure of time and space themselves, specifically whether time is composed of discrete, indivisible instants like frames in a film, or whether it flows as a continuous medium that cannot be broken into smaller pieces. If time is indeed made of individual moments strung together, then the paradox gains force because motion requires change of position over duration, yet that duration would always be zero at any point we choose to examine. However, if time is continuous and infinitely divisible, then motion occurs across infinitesimally small intervals, and we can describe velocity as the limit of position change over duration as that duration approaches zero. Modern physics and calculus have resolved this paradox through mathematical frameworks that handle infinity and infinitesimals with precision, yet the paradox persists in our imagination because it shall. Imagine the legendary hero Achilles preparing to race against a tortoise, a creature known for its slowness and deliberate movement, and yet the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno proposed that Achilles could never actually overtake the tortoise if the tortoise were given even the smallest head start in the race. The paradox unfolds through a series of logical steps that seem airtight at first consideration. Before Achilles can catch the tortoise, he must first reach the point where the tortoise started, but by the time he arrives at that location, the tortoise has moved forward to a new position, however slightly. Achilles then must reach this second position, yet again the tortoise has advanced further, and this process continues infinitely, with the gap between them never actually closing despite becoming progressively smaller. The mechanism at work here involves the ancient mind struggling with the concept of infinite series and the mathematical reality that an infinite number of steps can actually sum to a finite distance when each step becomes proportionally smaller than the last. We understand now through calculus and modern mathematics that infinite divisibility of space and time does not prevent motion or completion, that the sum of an infinite geometric series can indeed converge to a definite value, yet the paradox persists in our collective consciousness as a kind of intellectual puzzle that fascinates us despite having been thoroughly solved for centuries. What makes this particular paradox so enduring is that it reveals something fundamental about how human intuition resists the formal structures of mathematics, how our minds struggle to accept that infinite processes can have finite outcomes, and how we remain perpetually susceptible to logical arguments that seem to prove the impossible even when we possess the mathematical tools to understand exactly where the reasoning breaks down. Imagine two suspects arrested for a crime and placed in separate interrogation rooms with no ability to communicate with each other. Each prisoner is given the same choice: remain silent or betray the other person. If both remain silent, they each serve 1 year in prison. If one betrays while the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free while the silent one serves 3 years. If both betray each other, they each serve 2 years. The paradox emerges from the logical analysis of this situation, where the individually rational choice produces a collectively worse outcome than cooperation would achieve. Each prisoner, reasoning independently, recognizes that betrayal yields a better personal result regardless of what the other person does. If the other remains silent, betrayal means freedom instead of 1 year. If the other betrays, betrayal means 2 years instead of 3. From a purely self-interested perspective, betrayal is always the superior choice. Yet when both prisoners follow this individual logic, they end up with 2 years each instead of the 1 year they would have received through mutual silence. The mechanism that drives this paradox is the conflict between individual incentives and collective welfare, where trust becomes economically irrational and cooperation becomes a liability. This dynamic extends far beyond prison cells into arms races between nations, business negotiations between competitors, environmental resource management, and countless interpersonal relationships, where mutual cooperation would benefit everyone yet individual defection remains perpetually tempting. What makes this paradox particularly profound is that we observe it repeatedly across human societies, and yet seem unable to permanently resolve it, even when we fully understand the mechanism and recognize that we would all benefit from changing our behavior. Imagine a book burning in a fire, its pages consumed by flames until nothing remains but ash and smoke, and consider what physicists have puzzled over for decades. Where does the information go? According to classical thermodynamics, energy transforms but information seems to vanish entirely, yet according to quantum mechanics, information can never truly be destroyed, only scrambled beyond recognition. This is the information paradox, a fundamental contradiction that sits at the intersection of two of science's most successful theories, and it creates a genuine puzzle about the nature of reality itself. When Stephen Hawking proposed that black holes evaporate through radiation, he discovered something troubling. If a black hole contains infinite information about everything that fell into it, and that black hole eventually disappears, then that information appears to be lost forever, violating the quantum mechanical principle that information must be conserved. The mechanism behind this paradox operates through competing axioms that seem equally valid yet mutually exclusive, creating a logical stranglehold where accepting one principle means rejecting another. We cannot simply abandon quantum mechanics because it has proven correct countless times in laboratory settings, nor can we abandon thermodynamics because it governs nearly every physical process we observe. The paradox persists because both frameworks describe reality accurately within their domains, yet they generate contradictory predictions when applied to extreme conditions like those near black holes. Despite having no actual resolution in mainstream physics, despite the fact that textbooks still teach both principles as foundational truths, despite the apparent irrationality of accepting two contradictory ideas simultaneously, physicists continue working within this framework, slowly accumulating evidence that information might be preserved through mechanisms we do not yet understand. Consider the curious situation of a time traveler who journeys backward through the years and encounters their own grandfather before he ever met the time traveler's grandmother. And in a moment of rage or accident, the traveler kills this man before any offspring could be conceived, which would logically mean the traveler's parent was never born, which would mean the traveler themselves was never born, which would mean they could never have traveled back in time to commit the act in the first place. Yet somehow they are already there, already holding the weapon, already caught in the act of preventing their own existence. This is the ontological paradox, a strange and recursive loop where the very preconditions necessary for an event to occur are paradoxically negated by that event's consequences, creating a logical contradiction that seems to violate the basic rules of causality and existence itself. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental clash between linear causality and temporal mechanics, where information or matter appears to create itself without any prior origin, generating itself ex nihilo through a closed causal loop that requires no external cause to initiate it. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is that it forces us to confront the possibility that causality itself might not be as straightforward as our intuitions suggest, that perhaps the universe operates on principles far stranger than simple cause and effect, or that such paradoxes simply cannot occur and reality possesses some hidden mechanism that prevents them. Despite the apparent logical impossibility, we have normalized discussions of time travel in fiction and physics, casually entertaining scenarios that contain these paradoxes without fully resolving them, building entire narrative worlds around contradictions we cannot explain, as if simply acknowledging the problem somehow makes it less troubling, when in fact we are all caught in th. Imagine you are presented with two sealed envelopes by a stranger, and you are told that one envelope contains twice as much money as the other, though you do not know which is which or what the actual amounts are. You are allowed to choose one envelope and open it to see how much money it contains, and then you face a critical decision. You may either keep the money you have found, or you may switch to the other unopened envelope. Now here is where the logical trap begins to close around your reasoning. Suppose you open your chosen envelope and discover it contains $100. At this moment, your mind begins to calculate the expected value of switching. You think to yourself that the other envelope must contain either $50, which would be half of what you have, or $200, which would be double what you have. Since you have no information about which scenario is true, you assign equal probability to each outcome, 50% and 50%. If you switch and find $50, you lose $50, but if you switch and find $200, you gain $100. The expected value of switching, therefore, appears to be 0.5 times negative $50 plus 0.5 times positive $100, which equals $25 in your favor. This calculation suggests you should always switch, yet here lies the paradox. Before you opened any envelope, by this same logic, you would have reasoned that switching was advantageous, no matter which envelope you initially selected. The paradox persists because our intuitive probability reasoning breaks down when we attempt to assign likelihoods to unknown quantities without proper reference frames. The mechanism behind this confusion involves the human tendency to treat the unopened envelope as a blank slate containing some mysterious unknown quantity, when in reality the entire probability structure was determined the moment the TW. Imagine you are offered a gambling game where a fair coin is flipped repeatedly, and the payout depends entirely on when the first heads appears. If heads shows on the first flip, you win $2. If it appears on the second flip, you win $4. If it takes 3 flips, you win $8, and the pattern continues indefinitely, doubling each time. The question then becomes deceptively simple. How much money would you be willing to pay to play this game just once? According to mathematical expectation, the answer should be infinite. When you calculate the expected value by multiplying each possible outcome by its probability and summing them all together, the total approaches infinity, which would theoretically justify paying any amount of money to participate. Yet in real life, most rational people would only pay somewhere between $15 and $25 to play, despite what pure mathematics suggests they should pay. This contradiction between theoretical expectation and practical behavior has puzzled economists and mathematicians for nearly 3 centuries, since Daniel Bernoulli first described it in 1738. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something fundamental about human decision-making and how we actually value risk. Our brains inherently diminish the psychological significance of increasingly large rewards through a process called diminishing marginal utility, meaning that winning $1 million feels tremendously better than winning 1,000, but winning $2 million feels only marginally better than 1 million. Additionally, the exponential decline in probability as outcomes become more extreme means that while the mathematical expectation is infinite, the practical likelihood of winning enormous sums grows vanishingly small. Imagine a scenario where a superintelligent being, one with such extraordinary predictive abilities that it has never been wrong, presents you with 2 boxes and explains the following. Box A contains $1,000, which you can see, and Box B contains either $1 million or nothing at all, which remains sealed and hidden from your view. The superintelligent being has already made a prediction about your choice before this moment ever arrived, and based on that prediction alone, it has filled Box B accordingly. If it predicted you would take both boxes, it left Box B empty, but if it predicted you would take only Box B, it placed $1 million inside. Now you must choose, do you take both boxes, securing at minimum the $1,000 you know exists, or do you take only Box B, gambling entirely on the being's prediction that you would make this very choice. This is Newcomb's paradox, a decision theory puzzle that has captivated philosophers and logicians for decades. The psychological tension emerges from two competing rational frameworks that seem equally valid yet lead to opposite conclusions. From one perspective, the causal decision theorist argues that your choice right now cannot possibly affect what the superintelligent being did in the past, so you should take both boxes and guarantee yourself at least $1,000 plus whatever might be in box B. From another perspective, the evidential decision theorist contends that your choice serves as strong evidence about what the being predicted. So taking only box B demonstrates you are exactly the type of person the being would have predicted would take only box B, maximizing your expected winnings. The paradox persists because it forces us to confront fundamental questions about free will, causality, and rational decision-making that have no universally accepted resolution. Imagine a woman named Sleeping Beauty agrees to participate in an unusual experiment that will test her reasoning about probability and consciousness. On Sunday evening, she is put to sleep, and a fair coin is flipped. If the coin lands on heads, she will be awakened on Monday, interviewed about her beliefs, and then put back to sleep with a memory-erasing drug so she won't remember the interview. If the coin lands on tails, she will be awakened on both Monday and Tuesday, interviewed each time, and given the same memory-erasing drug after each interview so she has no memory of previous awakenings. After all of this, she is awakened on Wednesday with full knowledge of the experimental protocol, but no memory of any interviews that may have occurred. Now here is the paradox. When Sleeping Beauty wakes up during the experiment and is asked, "What is your credence that the coin landed on heads?" what should she rationally answer? On one hand, before the experiment began, she knew the coin had a 50% chance of landing on heads, and nothing about being asleep should change that prior probability. However, from her perspective upon waking, she cannot determine which day it is or how many times she has been awakened before, and the coin landing on tails creates twice as many awakening events as heads does, which seems to mathematically favor the probability that she is in a tails scenario. This puzzle exposes a fundamental tension between two kinds of probability: the objective likelihood of an event in the external world and the subjective credence we should assign based on our limited perspective and available information. Philosophers remain genuinely divided on whether she should answer 1/2 or 1/3, with compelling arguments supporting both positions, revealing that our intuitions about probability, consciousness, and self-location in time are far more fragile and contested than we typically assume. Imagine a logician standing in a vast library, examining the fundamental nature of how we confirm our beliefs about the world, and they encounter a puzzle that seems almost absurdly simple, yet defies common sense entirely. The Raven paradox, first articulated by the philosopher Karl Hempel in the 1940s, presents us with a situation where pure logical reasoning leads us to a conclusion that our intuition rebels against with fierce resistance. The paradox works like this. Suppose we want to confirm the statement that all ravens are black, a universal claim about the entire population of ravens everywhere. According to the rules of basic logic and inductive reasoning, any observation that confirms this statement should count as evidence for it. If we see a black raven, that confirms our hypothesis. But here is where the logical mechanism reveals its troubling implications. The statement "all ravens are black" is logically equivalent to saying all non-black things are non-ravens. Therefore, by the strict rules of logical equivalence, observing a white shoe should count as evidence that all ravens are black, because a white shoe is indeed non-black and also non-raven, perfectly satisfying the contrapositive of our original statement. Yet our minds recoil from this conclusion with immediate and visceral resistance. We somehow know, or believe we know, that finding a white shoe tells us nothing whatsoever about the color of ravens, despite the fact that formal logic insists it must. This paradox persists in our thinking because it exposes a fundamental gap between how formal logical systems operate and how human reasoning actually navigates the world, revealing that we intuitively understand something about relevance and context that pure deductive logic cannot fully capture. And we continue to live with this unresolved tension between what our rational minds tell us should be true and what our intuitive understanding insists must be false. Imagine you are a contestant on a television game show, and before you stand three identical doors. Behind one of these doors is a prize, a car perhaps, while behind the other two doors are worthless goats. You are asked to choose one door and you select it, though you have no knowledge of what lies behind it. The host, a man named Monty Hall who knows exactly what is behind each door, then opens one of the two remaining doors that you did not choose, deliberately revealing a goat behind it. Now you are faced with a decision that seems simple on the surface, but contains a profound logical trap. The host asks if you would like to switch your choice to the remaining unopened door or if you would like to stay with your original selection. The paradox emerges from the fact that most people's intuition tells them it does not matter whether you switch or stay, that your odds remain 50-50, when in mathematical reality, switching gives you a 2/3 probability of winning the car, while staying with your original choice gives you only a 1/3 probability. The mechanism that makes this counterintuitive relates to how probability distributions shift when new information enters the equation. When you first chose your door, you had a 1/3 chance of being correct. That probability did not change when Monty opened a door, because Monty's action was not random. He specifically chose to reveal a goat, which means he provided you with non-random information that fundamentally altered the conditional probability of the remaining unopened door. Yet our minds resist this conclusion because we perceive the situation as symmetrical after the door is opened, believing that two remaining doors should each have equal likelihood. This cognitive bias, this resistance to understanding how conditional probability actually functions, persists even after the mathematics has been explained countless times. Picture a Cretan named Epimenides who makes a simple statement: all Cretans are liars. The moment he utters these words, we find ourselves trapped in a logical loop that has troubled philosophers for nearly 25 centuries. If what he says is true, then he himself must be a liar, which means his statement cannot be true. But if his statement is false, then not all Cretans are liars, which means some Cretans tell the truth, so his statement could actually be true after all. We spiral endlessly between these two positions, never finding solid ground. The paradox becomes even more intricate when we consider that Epimenides is speaking from within the group he is describing, making himself both the subject and the object of his claim, creating a strange recursive loop where truth and falsehood begin to devour each other. What makes this particular paradox so psychologically unsettling is that it exposes something fundamental about how language refers to itself, how statements can become self-referential in ways that break our normal logical systems. Our minds naturally expect language to point outward toward the world, describing things external to itself. Yet when we allow statements to fold back upon themselves, when we permit language to comment on its own truth value, the entire framework begins to collapse. We have internalized a way of thinking where categories remain separate and hierarchies of meaning stay neatly organized, yet Epimenides reminds us that this organization is fragile. Despite our sophisticated understanding of logic and mathematics, despite centuries of philosophical work attempting to resolve this paradox through formal systems and careful definitions, we have not truly eliminated the underlying problem, but rather learned to work around it, creating complex rules about types and levels of language to prevent such self-reference from occurring. Consider a librarian tasked with creating a comprehensive catalog of all catalogs within a vast library system, with one specific rule. The master catalog will include every catalog that does not include itself, but it will exclude any catalog that does include itself in its own listings. This seems like a perfectly reasonable organizational principle until the librarian confronts an inevitable question about the master catalog itself. Does the master catalog belong in the master catalog? If it does include itself, then by definition it should not include itself, because it only includes catalogs that do not include themselves. Yet if it does not include itself, then it must include itself, because it includes all catalogs that do not include themselves. The librarian finds themselves trapped in an endless logical loop with no escape route, no resolution, and no way to satisfy the original rule. This is Russell's paradox, discovered by the mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell in 1891, a fundamental contradiction lurking within the foundations of set theory itself. The mechanism operates through self-reference and negation, where a rule applied uniformly to all cases except itself creates an impossible situation when that rule must be applied to itself. We have become so accustomed to organizing information into categories and hierarchies that we rarely notice how easily these systems can implode when they attempt to be perfectly complete and self-encompassing. Despite knowing that this paradox exists and despite our full understanding of how it works, we continue to build databases, create organizational systems, and establish classification schemes that operate on essentially identical principles, each one theoretically vulnerable to the same logical collapse that Russell identified over a century ago. Consider the sheer mathematical improbability of our cosmic solitude. The observable universe contains an estimated 2 trillion galaxies, each harboring hundreds of billions of stars, and modern exoplanet research suggests that planets are extraordinarily common, orbiting most stars in the cosmos. Given these staggering numbers, the probability that Earth represents the only world to have ever spawned intelligent life seems astronomically remote. Yet when we look outward into the night sky and listen with our most sensitive instruments for signals from advanced civilizations, we encounter only silence. This is the Fermi paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who famously asked during a lunch conversation in 1950, "Where is everybody?" The paradox emerges from the collision between two seemingly incompatible observations: the statistical likelihood that intelligent alien life should exist somewhere among the cosmos, and the complete absence of any confirmed evidence that it does. We have constructed elaborate radio telescopes, conducted systematic searches for extraterrestrial intelligence, dispatched spacecraft beyond our solar system carrying messages to unknown recipients, yet nothing responds. The psychological mechanism underlying our struggle with this paradox stems from our deeply ingrained assumptions about the universe and our place within it. We have developed intuitions shaped by discovery and exploration throughout human history. Whenever we have ventured into unknown territories, we have found other civilizations, other peoples, other forms of intelligent life. We have unconsciously projected this pattern onto the cosmos itself, expecting that surely we would detect radio signals or observe megastructures or witness the technological signatures of civilizations far older and more advanced than ourselves. Imagine you're standing at one end of a room and you want to walk to the other side, a distance of 10 meters, yet before you can reach that destination, you must first travel half that distance, which is 5 meters, and before you can travel those 5 meters, you must first travel half of that distance, which is 2.5 meters, and before you can travel that distance, you must travel half of it again. And this having continues infinitely into smaller and smaller increments that never truly end, creating an infinite series of movements that logically should be impossible to complete, and yet you stand up and cross the room without hesitation. This is the essence of Zeno's paradoxes, ancient logical puzzles conceived by a Greek philosopher named Zeno of Elea around 2,500 years ago, which demonstrate how rational mathematical thinking can seem to prove that motion itself is impossible, that a fast runner can never overtake a slower one, because by the time the faster runner reaches the position where the slower runner was, the slower runner has already moved forward, and this process repeats infinitely. Suggesting that movement is logically impossible despite being an obvious feature of physical reality. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the conflict between infinite mathematical sequences and finite physical reality, between abstract logical reasoning and observable experience, and our minds struggle to reconcile how an infinite number of steps can somehow be completed in finite time, creating a sense of cognitive dissonance that has fascinated philosophers and mathematicians for millennia. We have come to understand these paradoxes through the development of calculus and modern mathematics, which demonstrates that infinite series can indeed sum to finite values, yet despite having the mathematical tools to resolve these apparent contradictions, Zeno's paradoxes persist in our cultural consciousness as Consider a simple scenario that plays out in everyday life. Imagine a farmer standing in a field with a single grain of wheat in front of him, and you ask whether this constitutes a heap, and the answer is clearly no, one grain is not a heap. Now imagine the farmer adds one more grain, making 2 grains total, and again you would agree this is not a heap. The farmer continues adding grains one by one, grain after grain after grain, and at each step you acknowledge that adding just a single grain to something that was not a heap cannot possibly transform it into a heap, because one grain makes no meaningful difference. Yet somehow, if the farmer were to continue this process thousands and thousands of times until millions of grains lay before you, you would undeniably call this a heap. The paradox emerges from this logical progression. If one grain cannot create a difference, then 2 cannot differ from 1 and 3 cannot differ from 2, and by this chain of reasoning stretching infinitely forward, a million grains should be indistinguishable from one grain, which is obviously absurd. This is the Sorites paradox, named after the Greek word for heap, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about the language we use and the concepts we apply to reality. The mechanism underlying this puzzle is the human reliance on vague predicates, words and categories that lack precise boundaries, terms like heap, bald, tall, or rich that we use constantly without ever establishing exactly where they begin and end. Our minds are built to think in gradations and approximations rather than absolute definitions, and this pragmatic adaptation usually serves us well when navigating the fuzzy world around us. Yet when we attempt to apply rigorous logical reasoning to these inherently vague concepts, we discover that our language system contains logical cracks that simply cannot be repaired through conventional thinking. Imagine a prisoner sitting in their cell on a Monday morning, informed by a judge that they will be hanged sometime during the following week, but the execution will come as a complete surprise. The prisoner will not know which day it will occur until the noose is placed around their neck. The prisoner, being logically minded, begins to reason through their predicament with cold mathematical precision. They think to themselves that the hanging cannot occur on Friday, because if they survived through Thursday evening, they would know with absolute certainty that Friday was the only remaining day, and therefore it would no longer be a surprise. Working backward through this logic, if Friday is eliminated, then Thursday also becomes impossible, because surviving until Wednesday evening would make Thursday the final remaining option, thus removing the element of surprise from that day as well. Continuing this reverse elimination process, the prisoner systematically eliminates Wednesday, then Tuesday, then Monday, until they conclude that no day during the week can possibly satisfy both conditions simultaneously, that they will be hanged and that it will be unexpected. Yet despite reaching this seemingly airtight logical conclusion, when the jailer arrives on Wednesday morning and escorts the prisoner to the gallows, the prisoner experiences genuine shock and surprise, proving that the logical reasoning was somehow incomplete or flawed in its assumptions. The paradox persists because our language and our logic fail to capture something essential about knowledge and expectation in temporal systems. The prisoner's error lies in assuming that logical deduction from a true premise must yield true conclusions, yet somehow the very act of reasoning destroys the conditions necessary for that reasoning to be valid. In a small town, there exists a barber who shaves all those men, and only those men who do not shave themselves. This simple premise creates an immediate logical crisis that has fascinated mathematicians and philosophers for generations because it forces us to confront a fundamental question about the barber himself. If the barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves, then we must ask whether the barber shaves himself, and this is where the paradox reveals its teeth. If the barber does shave himself, then he belongs to the category of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if the barber does not shave himself, then he belongs to the category of men who do not shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he must shave himself because that is precisely his function. We find ourselves trapped in an endless logical loop where both possibilities lead to contradiction, and no matter which path we choose, we arrive at an impossibility that refuses resolution. The mechanism driving this paradox operates through self-reference, the dangerous territory where definitions apply to themselves and create circular reasoning patterns that our rational minds struggle to escape. The barber's definition contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, much like asking whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself, a question that similarly spirals into paradoxical territory. We have learned to live with this paradox not by solving it, but by recognizing that the barber in the original formulation simply cannot exist, that the problem lies in the impossible conditions we have created rather than in logic itself. The paradox persists in our collective consciousness because it reveals something profound about language and definition, how our careful attempts to be precise can sometimes trap us in contradictions. Imagine a person who learns from a reliable source that they will die in a car accident next Tuesday, and so they decide to stay home that entire day to avoid driving, believing they have successfully prevented the predicted outcome. Yet what they fail to realize is that by staying home, they have unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that leads to their death in an entirely different way, perhaps through a gas leak in their house or a visitor arriving to check on them who causes an accident on their property. The very act of trying to prevent the predicted future becomes the mechanism through which that future is fulfilled, creating a closed causal loop where every attempt to escape the prophecy actually ensures its realization. This is the predestination paradox, a temporal entanglement where knowledge of a future event and the subsequent actions taken to avoid it become the direct cause of that event's occurrence. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a fundamental misunderstanding of causality and free will, as the person assumes they possess the ability to alter destiny through conscious choice. Yet the universe or fate operates according to a predetermined script where their choices were always part of the equation. We find this paradox deeply unsettling because it strips away the comfortable illusion that we are autonomous agents capable of reshaping our destinies, suggesting instead that even our desperate attempts to escape predetermined outcomes are themselves predetermined components of those very outcomes. The paradox persists in our collective consciousness through literature, film, and philosophy, because it mirrors our genuine anxiety about determinism and agency, touching something raw about the human condition regarding whether our choices matter or whether we are merely actors reciting lines we believe we are improvising. Imagine a hotel with infinitely many rooms, numbered 1, 2, 3, and continuing forever without end, with every single room occupied by a guest. A new traveler arrives at the front desk, tired and seeking shelter for the night. The manager, rather than turning them away, calmly assigns them to a room by instructing the guest in room 1 to move to room 2, the guest in room 2 to move to room 3, the guest in room 3 to move to room 4, and so on, with each existing guest shifting up by exactly one room number. Suddenly, room 1 becomes available for the new arrival, and miraculously, everyone has a place to sleep, including the newcomer who had nowhere to go moments before. The impossible has become not only possible, but actually accommodated through the sheer mechanics of infinity itself. This paradox deepens further when we consider an infinite bus arriving with infinitely many new passengers, all demanding rooms, and yet the manager employs an elegant mathematical solution by moving the guest from room 1 to room 2, room 2 to room 4, room 3 to room 6, room 4 to room 8, and so forth, doubling every existing guest's room number and thus opening up all the odd-numbered rooms for the infinite queue of new arrivals. The mechanism underlying this bewildering scenario reveals something profound about the nature of infinity and how our intuitions about finite spaces catastrophically fail when confronted with the boundless. When we operate in the finite world of normal hotels with 100 or 1,000 rooms, adding guests means running out of space eventually, and mathematics respects this scarcity absolutely. But infinity operates under entirely different rules that seem to violate every principle we learned about space, capacity, and availability. Imagine the wooden puppet Pinocchio, whose nose grows whenever he tells a lie, facing a moment of perfect logical collapse. He looks directly into your eyes and says with absolute certainty, "My nose will grow right now." In this single statement, the paradox unfolds with relentless precision, because if his nose grows, then his statement was true, which means his nose should not grow, but if his nose does not grow, then his statement was false, which means his nose should grow. The paradox traps us in an infinite loop of self-reference, where truth and falsehood become indistinguishable, where the very act of predicting an outcome based on honesty creates a contradiction that cannot be resolved by any logical mechanism we possess. What makes this paradox so deeply unsettling is that it reveals the fundamental fragility of self-referential systems, those moments when language or logic turns inward upon itself and discovers that it cannot account for its own nature. The puppet's statement is neither true nor false in any stable sense. It exists in a state of perpetual oscillation where both conditions simultaneously demand their own negation. We encounter similar structures in our everyday lives whenever we make predictions about ourselves or observe our own consciousness, creating strange loops where the observer becomes the observed and the observed becomes the observer. This paradox has persisted throughout centuries of philosophical inquiry precisely because it exposes something genuine about the limits of formal systems, demonstrating that not all grammatically coherent statements can be assigned truth values, and that self-reference remains one of the most dangerous tools available to human thought. Yet perhaps this is precisely why we find self-reference so compelling. It forces us to confront the possibility that some questions might not have answers, that reality itself may contain genuine contradictions that no amount of logical refine. Imagine a being of absolute power, one with the capability to do anything whatsoever without limitation or constraint, a deity or force so mighty that it exists beyond the boundaries of physics and logic itself. Now consider this question. Can this all-powerful being create something so heavy that even they cannot lift it? The moment you ask this question, you find yourself trapped in an infinite logical loop, where any answer seems to destroy the very premise of omnipotence upon which the question depends. If the being can create such an object, then they cannot lift it, which means they are not all-powerful. If they cannot create such an object, then there exists something they cannot do, which again means they are not truly omnipotent. This apparent logical contradiction has puzzled philosophers, theologians, and thinkers for centuries, emerging repeatedly across different cultures and belief systems whenever the concept of absolute power is contemplated. The paradox functions by revealing a fundamental incompatibility between the concept of omnipotence and the logical laws that govern how we reason about power and capability in the universe. It demonstrates that omnipotence, when defined as the ability to do literally anything without exception, creates a set of conditions that are logically contradictory and therefore impossible to satisfy simultaneously. What makes this paradox so psychologically compelling is that it challenges our intuitive understanding of what power actually means, forcing us to recognize that even infinite power operates within certain logical constraints that cannot be violated without becoming meaningless. We continue to wrestle with this paradox not because we expect to find a practical solution, but because it reveals something profound about the limits of language, logic, and conceptual thinking itself, suggesting that some ideas are simply too large or too internally contradictory for human minds to fully weigh. Imagine two identical twins born on Earth, sharing the same moment of birth, the same genetic code, the same starting point in spacetime. One twin remains on our planet, living out a normal life, aging at the standard human rate, while the other twin boards a spacecraft capable of traveling at nearly the speed of light. This second twin travels away from Earth at an enormous velocity, spends what feels like 5 years in space from their perspective, and then returns home. According to the mathematics of Einstein's special relativity, when the traveling twin steps off that spacecraft, they will have aged only 5 years, while their earthbound sibling will have aged decades, perhaps 50 or 60 years or more. The traveling twin is now biologically younger than their identical twin, despite being born at the same moment. This is not a theoretical abstraction or a thought experiment with no real consequences. The effect has been measured with atomic clocks aboard aircraft, and it occurs because time genuinely moves at different rates depending on how fast an object is moving through space. The faster you travel, the slower time moves for you relative to a stationary observer. The psychological grip of this paradox stems from our deepest intuition about time and fairness and the nature of identity. We assume that twins born together should age together, that the passage of time should be universal and absolute, that biological age should remain synchronized across space. Yet the universe operates on principles far stranger than our evolutionary psychology prepared us to comprehend. We have normalized this paradox by accepting it as established physics, by teaching it in universities, by confirming it with experiments, and yet it continues to feel fundamentally wrong, a violation of some basic law we intuitively believed governed existence. Imagine taking a solid sphere, perhaps a ball made of infinitely divisible mathematical material, and cutting it into a finite number of pieces using only geometric divisions, then reassembling those exact same pieces into two spheres that are each identical in size and volume to the original, creating something from nothing through pure mathematical logic. This is the Banach-Tarski paradox, a theorem proven in 1924 by mathematicians Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, stating that a solid ball in three-dimensional space can indeed be decomposed and rearranged into two solid balls of the same radius as the original, violating our deepest intuitions about conservation and the physical nature of matter. The mechanism underlying this seemingly impossible feat relies on the existence of non-measurable sets within infinite-dimensional mathematics, meaning that when you dissect the sphere using an infinite number of impossibly complex rotations and selections, you create fragments that possess no well-defined volume, allowing you to manipulate space itself in ways that defy our finite human perception and physical laws. The pieces cannot be constructed by any practical physical process, nor can they be visualized in any meaningful way, because they exist only as abstract mathematical objects that exploit the infinite density of points and the non-commutative properties of rotations in 3 dimensions. What makes this paradox persist in our minds, despite its logical soundness within set theory, is our inability to separate mathematical infinity from physical reality, our stubborn belief that the laws governing infinitely small divisions must somehow align with the macroscopic universe we inhabit. and our natural resistance to accepting that rigorous proof can lead to conclusions that seem to violate the fundamental principle that you cannot create matter from nothing. Imagine a sealed box containing a cat, a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison gas, all isolated from external observation. According to the rules of quantum mechanics, the radioactive atom exists in a superposition of states. It has simultaneously decayed and not decayed until the moment someone opens the box to observe the contents. The paradox emerges when we apply this quantum logic to the macroscopic world. If the atom's state is undetermined until observed, then the cat inside must logically exist in both a living and dead state at the same time, suspended between two contradictory realities. This thought experiment, proposed by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935, was intended to highlight the absurdity of extending quantum superposition principles to everyday objects and living creatures. Yet the paradox persists in our collective consciousness not because it describes reality accurately, but because it forces us to confront a fundamental gap between how the quantum world operates and how our lived experience functions. We accept that subatomic particles behave in ways that defy intuition, existing in multiple states simultaneously until measurement collapses them into singular outcomes. However, our minds resist applying this same logic to a cat, which we instinctively know must be either alive or dead, never both at once. The paradox endures precisely because it exploits this cognitive dissonance, revealing our deep uncertainty about where the boundary lies between the quantum realm and the classical world we inhabit. We have normalized this confusion by treating Schrödinger's cat not as a literal description, but as a metaphorical gateway to understanding the strange rules governing reality at its smallest scales. Imagine a musician from the future travels backward in time and gives Beethoven a complete collection of all his own symphonies, the very compositions that Beethoven would go on to create throughout his lifetime. Beethoven then publishes these works under his own name, and they become the masterpieces we know today. The question that emerges from this scenario is both simple and deeply unsettling. Where did these symphonies actually come from? They were not composed by Beethoven in the traditional sense, nor were they created by the time traveler, yet they exist in our world as real, tangible works of art. This is the bootstrap paradox, a temporal loop where information or objects exist without ever being created, pulled into existence by their own future selves in a causal circle that has no beginning point. The paradox derives its name from the impossible concept of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, an action that defies the laws of physics and logic. The psychological mechanism that allows us to grapple with this paradox involves our acceptance of causality as fundamental to reality. We are accustomed to thinking in linear terms where causes precede effects, where creation must happen before a thing can exist, and where information must originate from some source. The bootstrap paradox obliterates these comfortable assumptions by presenting a scenario where something exists without ever being made, violating our deepest intuitions about how reality functions. Yet despite the logical impossibility of this situation, science fiction writers, philosophers, and physicists continue to explore it with genuine interest, suggesting that perhaps our universe contains strange loopholes we do not yet understand, or that time travel itself would inevitably create such contradictions that our minds struggle to fully reconcile. Imagine you possess the ability to travel backward through time, and you decide to journey to the year when your grandfather was a young man, decades before your parent was ever born, and in this moment of temporal displacement, you encounter him walking down a street in his youth, completely unaware of the future that awaits him, and you make the deliberate choice to prevent him from ever meeting your grandmother. Or perhaps you go further and you prevent him from ever existing at all by eliminating him entirely from the timeline, and in doing so you erase the chain of causality that led to your own birth, which creates the fundamental logical contradiction known as the grandfather paradox. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates on the principle that causality flows in one direction, that actions have consequences that ripple forward through time, and that cause must always precede effect in a linear progression from past to future. Yet if you travel backward and alter the conditions necessary for your own existence, you create a logical impossibility where you both exist and do not exist simultaneously. Where the action you took could never have been taken because you would never have been born to take it, and where the very timeline you modified would prevent your time travel from ever occurring in the first place. This paradox reveals something profound about how our minds struggle to reconcile free will with determinism, how we wrestle with the notion that our choices might alter reality itself, and how we assume that time operates as a simple line rather than a more complex structure. Yet despite centuries of philosophical contemplation and decades of scientific inquiry into quantum mechanics and relativity, we continue to discuss time travel scenarios as though they remain genuinely possible. As though the grandfather paradox represents merely a practical problem to be solved rather than evidence that backward time travel may be. Imagine a ship that belongs to the people of Athens, a vessel so important to their history and identity that they preserve it with meticulous care, replacing each wooden plank as it decays and weakens over the passing years, swapping out the sails when they fray, updating the ropes as they rot, until eventually every single component that made up the original ship has been replaced with new material, leaving you with a profound question that has haunted philosophers for centuries. Is this still the same ship? The paradox emerges when you consider that if someone were to collect every single piece removed during these replacements and reassemble them back into the original configuration, you would have two ships claiming equal right to be called the true Ship of Theseus. Yet logically, they cannot both be the authentic original. This thought experiment forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our concept of identity and continuity is far more fragile and arbitrary than we typically assume, revealing that we have no objective criteria for determining what makes something remain itself over time, despite the complete transformation of its physical substance. The psychological mechanism at work here is our deep human need to establish persistent identity in a world of constant change, a need so fundamental that we've constructed elaborate logical frameworks to justify our choices even when those frameworks collapse under scrutiny. We apply this same flawed reasoning to ourselves constantly, never quite acknowledging that the atoms composing your body are entirely different from those that made up your body 7 years ago, that your thoughts and beliefs have shifted so dramatically that younger you would be unrecognizable to current you. Yet we persist in treating ourselves as singular continuous entities deserving of responsibility and memory and attachment. Consider the simple statement, "This sentence is false." When you attempt to evaluate its truth value, you enter a logical trap from which there is no escape. If the statement is true, then what it claims about itself must be accurate, which means the sentence itself is false, creating an immediate contradiction. Conversely, if the statement is false, then its claim that it is false becomes accurate, making it true, which again produces a contradiction. You find yourself trapped in an infinite loop where the truth value cannot be determined because the very act of assigning a value generates its opposite. This is the liar's paradox, and it has haunted philosophy, mathematics, and logic for thousands of years, originating in ancient Greece with the philosopher Eubulides. The paradox reveals something profound about the nature of self-reference and the limits of formal logical systems. When a statement refers to itself, it creates a strange loop that ordinary logical frameworks cannot accommodate. Most mathematical and logical systems have been forced to develop elaborate rules specifically designed to exclude self-referential statements from consideration, treating them as meaningless or undecidable rather than genuinely true or false. What makes this paradox so psychologically disorienting is that it demonstrates the fundamental instability of certain ideas when they turn inward on themselves. We spend our daily lives assigning truth values to statements without difficulty, yet this one simple sentence exposes a blind spot in how we understand language, truth, and meaning itself. The paradox persists not because it represents a genuine logical problem that logic will one day solve, but because it highlights a real boundary where our systems of meaning break down when confronted with perfect self-reference.